What's up everyone? You're here at Watch Harry. We're dropping something epic today. Petunia found Lily's hidden blood contract and Dumbledore lost 22 ancient protections over Harry in 1 hour. Like and subscribe if you enjoy. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The letter in the floorboards. The morning of July 31st came in like every other morning at number 4, Privet Drive, grey at the edges, still smelling of last night's overcooked cabbage, the boiler making that sound in the pipes that Vernon had been promising to fix since 1987. The sparrows on the garden wall were arguing about something. The Thompsons' Tabby was watching them from the fence post with the flat, patient malice that only cats and tax inspectors truly master. Petunia Dursley was awake before 6. She was always awake before 6. She told herself it was because she liked the quiet, liked having the kitchen to herself before Dudley came thundering down wanting 3 kinds of cereal and Vernon started in about the news. But the truth, which she didn't examine too closely on most mornings, was that she woke up at 5:53 because that was approximately when the dreams got bad enough that lying still stopped being a workable option. She didn't remember the dreams. She only remembered the color of them, green, vivid and terrible, the shade of summer grass and broken glass at the same time. She put on her dressing gown. She went downstairs. She filled the kettle. The boys' cupboard was quiet. That was the only way she had ever let herself think of it. The boys' cupboard. As though he were a category, a responsibility, a clause in some agreement she'd never wanted to sign. She stood at the kitchen counter while the kettle heated and looked at the cupboard door under the stairs and did not think about the fact that today was his birthday. She did not think about the fact that he was 11 today, which meant September was coming, which meant something was coming. She didn't know exactly what, but she had known for years that something would, because Dumbledore's letter had said until he comes of age, and 11 was not of age but 11 was something. There was a world out there that had been waiting for this boy since before he could walk, and she could feel it getting closer the way you feel weather coming in off the sea. She poured her tea. She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at the window and watched the garden go from dark to gray to pale gold, and she thought, as she did every July 31st, about Lily. Not on purpose. She never did it on purpose. Lily at 7, standing in the back garden of their house in Cokeworth, catching a falling leaf before it hit the ground and looking at Petunia with those bright, laughing eyes. Did you see, Toonie, did you see it stop? Lily at 11, getting the letter, the genuine article with the wax seal and the owl and everything, and their mother had cried happy tears while Petunia stood in the doorway and understood for the first time what it felt like to be on the outside of something. Lily at 20, sitting across from Petunia in this very kitchen, not this house, the old one, before the wedding, with her red hair tied back and her hands wrapped around a mug and saying quietly, "I'm going to have a baby, Toonie. I wanted you to know first." Petunia had said something cold. She couldn't remember exactly what. She'd been good at cold, back then. It was armor and she'd worn it so long she'd forgotten it was armor and started to think it was just her face. She drank her tea. She did not cry. She hadn't cried about Lily in years, which either meant she'd finished grieving or meant she'd buried it somewhere so deep that the roots had grown through her bones and she'd stopped being able to tell the difference between the grief and herself. She stood up to rinse her cup, and that was when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More of a feeling, a change in pressure, like when a storm front rolls in and the air gets heavy and the birds go quiet. She stopped with her hand on the tap and stood very still and listened to the house. The boiler. The sparrows outside. Dudley's faint snoring from upstairs. And then, very clearly, a sound she hadn't heard in 10 years, a low, harmonic hum, like a crystal glass being run with a wet finger, coming from directly beneath the stairs. She turned around slowly. The cupboard door was still closed. Nothing had changed. The boy was still asleep in there, probably, because she hadn't heard him stir yet, and he was quiet in the mornings, too quiet, had always been too quiet in a way that should have alarmed her more than it did, but she'd told herself that was just his personality. The hum came again. She walked to the cupboard door. She put her hand flat on it and felt warmth. Not the warmth of a sleeping child. Something older than that. Something with an edge to it, like sunlight through colored glass. She pulled her hand back. "I am not doing this," she said aloud, to no one. The hum didn't care. It got a half note higher and pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat. Petunia Dursley was a practical woman. She had made herself practical the way some people make themselves cruel, as a deliberate act, sustained over years, chosen every morning when she got out of bed and decided that practical women did not think about magic and did not feel the thing in the back of their chest that wanted to lean toward it like a plant toward light. She had been enormously, painstakingly practical for 35 years and she was very tired of it. She opened the cupboard door. Harry was asleep, curled on his side on the narrow cot, dark hair splayed over the thin pillow, glasses folded on the little shelf above his head. He was small for 10, for 11, she corrected herself. Today he was 11, and in sleep his face lost the careful blankness he wore when he was awake around Vernon, and he looked very young and very much like James Potter, which she had always resented, and underneath that, the part she'd buried deepest, very much like Lily around the eyes and the forehead and the particular way his mouth went when he was dreaming something pleasant. The hum was coming from under him. From under the cot itself. She looked at the cot. She looked at the floor. There was a loose floorboard under the left rear leg of the cot, had always been loose. Vernon had complained about it once and then forgotten it. She hadn't thought about it in years. She thought about it now. She crouched down. She moved the cot leg aside. The board rocked slightly, uneven, and she got her fingernails under the edge and lifted, and there it was, a hollow space about the size of a shoebox, and inside it, a single folded piece of parchment tied with a ribbon the color of dried blood. Not tied. Sealed. The ribbon was sealed around it in a complex knot that she could see without looking at it directly. Was not a normal knot, was the kind of thing that meant something, the kind of thing Lily used to do with her hair ties when she was practicing, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor and making things move and stop and change. The parchment was humming. Low and steady and warm, like something alive. She picked it up. The hum moved into her hands the moment she touched it, and she felt it travel up her arms and into her chest, and she made a sound that was not quite a word, more of a caught breath, because it felt like someone had put a hand on her shoulder in the dark. She sat down on the floor of the cupboard, her back against the doorframe, Harry still asleep 2 feet away, and she looked at the folded parchment in her hands and read what was written on the outside in Lily's handwriting, the handwriting she would have recognized in her sleep, in her grave, at the end of the world, for Petunia. "Open when you're ready to be honest." Her throat closed. "Typical," she whispered. Because it was. It was so completely, maddeningly, heartbreakingly typical of Lily Evans to write something like that. Not open in case of emergency or open when Harry turns 11 or even open when I'm gone. Just, open when you're ready to be honest. As though she'd known exactly how long it would take. As though she'd timed it. 10 years. Give or take a few hours. Petunia untied the ribbon. It unknotted the moment she touched it with intention, slipping loose like it had been waiting for precisely this set of fingers on precisely this morning, and the parchment unfolded, not just unfolded, but expanded, multiple sheets separating from what had looked like one, and she saw that she was holding something considerable. A letter. Pages of it. And woven through the paper itself, visible when she tilted it toward the window's pale early light, were threads of something that wasn't ink. They looked like copper wire seen through silk, intricate and purposeful, running through every page in patterns that made her eyes do something complicated when she tried to follow them. She started reading. "Toonie, if you're reading this, it means the contract woke up, which means something changed, which probably means it's his birthday and something is finally happening the way it was always going to. I know you. I know you've been telling yourself this day would never come. You've been practical about it, haven't you? Very sensible. Mom would say you were being sensible. I need you to read all of this. Not skim it. Not fold it back up and put it under the kettle and tell yourself you'll read it later. All of it, right now, wherever you are. The contract has conditions and you've already triggered the first one just by opening it, which means the audit has started, and if you stop reading partway through then the audit will pause and some things will be left half done and I can't have that. I love you. I am angry at you and I love you. Those two things are both true and I've made peace with that. Now read. Petunia read. The letter was 23 pages long. She knew because she counted them when she turned the first page and saw how many there were, and she thought, with something between exasperation and fierce, aching love, of course it is, Lily, of course it's 23 pages, you never used one word when 40 would do. The first 6 pages were the letter. Lily's voice, direct and clear and precise, explaining what the following pages were and how they worked and what Petunia needed to understand before she read the contract itself. It was not condescending. Lily had always been careful not to be condescending about magic, even when Petunia had practically dared her to be. It was more like the voice of someone who knew exactly how much the other person didn't know and was going to remedy that as efficiently as possible. Lily explained blood magic. Not the dark kind, not what most people thought of when they heard the phrase, which Lily dismissed in parentheses with characteristic impatience as a cheap theater version of something that's actually quite old and quite serious. Blood magic in its original form was contractual magic. It used the caster's own life, their own continued existence in the magical record, as both the power source and the guarantee. It was the oldest form of charms. It predated Hogwarts. It predated wands. It was the kind of magic that people had used when words and intent and willingness to bleed were the only tools available, and it worked not because it was violent but because it was true, because you could not use your own blood to lie. The blood knew. Lily had used it once before in her life, and she'd used it to make Harry. Not Harry himself, she clarified, she hadn't made Harry with magic. Harry was hers and James's and came from love not contracts, she was very clear on this point, but she had used blood magic to make the protections around Harry. The ones everyone thought were a simple sacrificial charm, a beautiful accident of a mother dying for her child. They weren't accidental. They weren't simple. They were a construction, 7 years in the making, that Lily had begun drafting in the summer before Harry was born when she'd first understood what the war was and what Voldemort specifically wanted and what it would mean for a child born at the end of July in that particular year. She'd done the research. She'd found the old texts. She'd practiced. She'd built it piece by piece in secret, even from James, who she loved and trusted and who would have worried himself sick, and when the time came and she had stood between the killing curse and her son, she hadn't just loved him and died. She had activated a contract 10 months in the making. She had given it everything. And what it had built around Harry Potter was not one protection. It was 22. Petunia stopped reading when she reached that page. She sat with it for a moment, her finger on the number, and looked at Harry still sleeping on the cot with his mouth slightly open and his socks not matching, one white, one that had once been white and was now the gray of old dishwater, and she thought about 10 years of this boy flinching when Vernon raised his voice, 10 years of thin and quiet and not enough, and something that had been cold inside her for a very long time began, slowly and without permission, to catch. She kept reading. The 22 protections were listed, explained, cross-referenced. Some of them she recognized from Lily's description, the love shield, the one everyone knew about, the one that burned dark magic on contact with Harry's skin. Some of them she had never heard of and couldn't fully follow even with Lily's clear explanations, things with names in Latin and Old Norse that spoke to deep, layered magic about identity and recognition and the relationship between a person's truest self and the world's ability to perceive it. One of them, she had to read it 3 times, was a protection against deliberate diminishment. Against anyone, magical or not, attempting to systematically reduce Harry's understanding of his own nature and capability. She read that one again. Deliberate diminishment. Any individual who, through action, instruction, or systemic arrangement, intentionally reduces the subject's access to knowledge of their own magical nature, heritage, and capability, or who actively works to suppress the subject's magical development or self-knowledge for purposes other than the subject's genuine welfare, will find their influence over the subject cancelled and their actions reviewed by the contract's audit function. She turned the page. The next section was titled Audit Status. Lily's handwriting here was smaller, tighter, the handwriting she used when she was being precise about something technical. When you opened this letter and I know you, when you opened it and the audit began, the contract will have started checking. It checks everything. Every protection, whether it's intact or compromised, who compromised it, when, how, and whether the compromise was sanctioned. This takes approximately 1 hour to complete. I've tested the calculation. 62 minutes on average. While the audit runs, the compromised protections will begin to restore themselves, which will have some effects I'll describe in a moment. What I need you to understand, Toonie, is that the contract has already found problems. I can't know the specifics. I built in the audit function but I won't be there to read the results, but I built it to be very thorough, and if you're reading this 10 years after Harry was born, then 10 years have passed without the contract being activated and without anyone checking, and I need you to trust me when I tell you that things will have been moved. Protections don't just weaken on their own. They can be redirected. Siphoned. Someone with enough knowledge of blood magic could, over time, take the power from a contract's secondary protections, not the primary love shield. That one is built different, that one is mine all the way down, they can't touch it, but the secondary ones, the identity protections, the knowledge protections, the heritage and capability shields, those can be drawn off, redirected to something else, drained slowly enough that no one notices. I want to be wrong about this. I want you to do the audit and find everything intact. If everything is intact, wonderful, I will have written 23 pages for nothing and you can use them to line a drawer. But I don't think I'm wrong. I built in a section for the audit results. Page 19. When the audit completes, the writing will appear. You'll see what's been taken, who took it, where it went. Petunia looked up. Harry was awake. She hadn't heard him wake up. He was just suddenly there, sitting up on his cot, looking at her with those green eyes, Lily's eyes, always Lily's eyes, with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite getting there, because underneath the careful blankness he'd trained himself to wear, he was curious. He'd always been curious, this boy, curious the way fire is warm, just part of the basic nature of the thing. Aunt Petunia, he said. His voice was still rough with sleep. She looked at him. She looked at the parchment in her hands. She thought about folding it up, putting it away, saying something about breakfast. She thought about how many times she had folded things up over the years. She thought about what page 19 was going to say. Your mother, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, wrote you a letter. Harry's face did something complicated and immediate, the blankness cracked straight down the middle, and what came through underneath it was not the sadness she'd braced for but something rawer and more awake, a kind of want so acute it was almost painful to look at. What? He said. She wrote a letter. For me, technically, but, she stopped. Started again. She wrote a letter and there's a contract attached and I've been reading it and I think, she stopped again, because what she thought was sprawling and terrible and she wasn't sure she had the right words for it yet. Harry had swung his feet off the cot. He reached for his glasses and put them on in one practiced move, and then he looked at the parchment in her hands with an expression that she realized, too late to be sensible about it, broke something open inside her chest that she'd thought was finished breaking. He had never had anything from his mother. Not one thing. She had made sure of it. She had been so determined, so practical about it, no photos, no stories, no this is what Lily was like, because she had told herself it was for his protection, for stability, for the good sense of raising a normal child in a normal house. But sitting on the floor of his cupboard on the morning of his 11th birthday, Petunia Desley looked at the want on her nephew's face and let herself, for the first time, call it what it was. It had been cruelty. Not intentional, perhaps. Not with malice. But cruelty all the same. "Come here," she said. He came and sat next to her on the floor, close enough that she could feel the warmth off him, and she showed him the letter and she kept reading, and as she read she spoke it aloud, and that was how, on the morning of his 11th birthday, Harry Potter first heard his mother's voice, through his aunt's mouth, in the cramped floor of his own cupboard, with the early morning sun coming through the cracks in the staircase and painting stripes of gold across the pages of a blood contract that had been waiting 10 years to wake up. Petunia read for 40 minutes. Harry listened without interrupting, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected him to have questions, had braced for the questions, but he just listened with a quality of stillness that she recognized because she'd seen it in Lily too, the ability to absorb a great deal and hold it before reacting, the kind of stillness that isn't absence of feeling but rather feeling so concentrated it went quiet. When she reached page 18, the last page before the audit results, she paused. The writing on page 19 was still blank. Just cream-colored parchment with the copper thread lines running through it like a waiting circuit. It said 62 minutes, Harry said. "I know. And you started reading, what, around 6? She checked the clock. She could see through the cupboard doorway. 6:15, roughly. He looked at page 19. So 10 minutes, maybe. She looked at him. Really looked, the way she'd been not doing for 10 years. He was looking at the blank page with a focused calm that she recognized as the same expression Lily had worn in her nude exams. He was scared, she could see that in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands were very still in his lap, but the fear wasn't stopping him. He wanted to know. Whatever the page was going to say, he wanted to know more than he was afraid. "Harry," she said. He looked up. She couldn't finish it. Or rather, she could, she had the words, but they felt enormous and insufficient at the same time. She tried a different approach. "I should have read this earlier. I should have read it years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't know it was there." "I should have looked. I knew, I felt that something was wrong. From the beginning, there was something wrong about how normal I was trying to make everything, and I ignored it because ignoring it was easier." She looked at her hands. "That's not an excuse." "No," he agreed, quietly, without cruelty. "But it's honest." And she almost smiled at that, because it was so exactly what Lily would have said, the same turn of phrase, the same careful refusal to either condemn or excuse, and she did not say "you're so like her" because that wasn't something she'd earned the right to say yet, but she thought it. The parchment in her hands warmed. Both of them looked down. Page 19 began to fill. The writing came in slowly, not like ink being spilled but like something being carved from the inside, careful, deliberate, the way truth tends to arrive when it arrives at all. It was not Lily's handwriting. It was something older, something that felt like the contract itself writing, and it listed things in clear, numbered lines with an absence of drama that somehow made it worse. Petunia read. Then she read it again. Then she sat with it for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes while the room was very quiet around them. Harry reached over and took the page from her hands because she had gone still in a way that concerned him, and he read it himself. She watched him read it. She watched his face. He didn't go pale. He didn't make a sound. His jaw tightened once and his breathing changed, steadied, actually, deepened, the way breathing does when someone is making an active decision about how to receive something, and he read the whole page with those green eyes moving line by line, and when he'd finished he lowered the parchment to his knee and stared at the far wall of the cupboard. The audit results listed 22 protections. Of those 22, 17 were compromised. Of those 17, 14 had been actively redirected, drawn off and fed into external structures, and 3 had been deliberately suppressed. The external structures named were, the wards at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, 9 protections, redirected between 1982 and 1991, and the protective network of the Order of the Phoenix, 5 protections, redirected between 1981 and 1988. The individual named as responsible for the redirections was Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The contract did not comment. It did not editorialize. It just listed the facts in the same clear, unhurried text, and at the bottom of the page, in Lily's handwriting, which was different from the contract's writing, warmer and more ragged with something that might have been anger or grief or both, I hoped I was wrong. Harry put the page down on his knee. He looked at his hands. He looked at the wall. Then he looked at Petunia. He used my mum's magic, he said, to protect Hogwarts. And the Order? Yes. For 10 years. Starting the year after she died. He nodded slowly. Not in acceptance. More the way you nod when you're cataloging something, filing it somewhere you can find it again. What happens now? He asked. The contract said the compromised protections would start restoring. They already started, Petunia said. She could feel it. Had been feeling it since she'd picked up the parchment, that slow warm pulse, but it was stronger now, had been getting stronger all through the reading, and now it was almost a vibration in the air, the kind of thing you feel in your teeth before a thunderstorm. I think they finished. When the audit completed. Harry was quiet. Then, very slowly, he held out his hand, palm up, and looked at it. And something happened that Petunia had last seen in the back garden in Cokeworth when she was 9 years old. The light in the room shifted, bent slightly toward his hand, not in any dramatic way, not like a special effect, just a small natural turn of it, the way sunflowers move, and in the cup of his palm there was a warmth, a faint ambient warmth, like an ember getting reacquainted with air. He closed his hand. Opened it. The warmth was still there. Oh, he said, very quietly, with a kind of wonder he wasn't trying to hide. Petunia looked at him. She looked at the parchment. She looked at the audit results and the 14 specific, documented redirections and the name at the bottom, and she felt something that was entirely new to her experience, a clarity, cold and clean and absolute, the feeling of a woman who has been practical for too long suddenly understanding the precise shape of what she's been practical about. She stood up. Get dressed, she said. We're not staying in the kitchen when they come. Harry looked up. When who comes? She held up the parchment. This thing triggered an audit in the magical world's equivalent of a legal record. I read enough of your mother's explanations to know that this type of contract, when it completes an audit with these kinds of findings, files a copy, automatically, by blood magic law, with the relevant governing authorities. She paused. I don't know exactly who those are or how quickly they respond. But I know that somewhere, right now, someone official in your world just received a very detailed report with Albus Dumbledore's name on it. Harry stared at her. And I know, she continued, and her voice had gone to something she hadn't used in years, the voice she'd had before she made herself small, the voice that was more Lily than she'd ever admitted, that Dumbledore will know the contract activated the moment those protections started leaving Hogwarts. Harry was very still. He'll come here, Harry said. He'll come here, she agreed. Or he'll send someone. And I intend to be ready when he does. She stepped out of the cupboard. She straightened her dressing gown. She looked at the stairs and then back at her nephew, who was watching her from the floor of his cupboard with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not hope, exactly, something more complicated than that, something that knew better than to be uncomplicated hope but couldn't help reaching toward the light all the same. Aunt Petunia, he said. Yes. She loved you, he said. The letter. The way she wrote. She loved you. She turned away before he could see her face, and she went into the kitchen and she put the kettle on and she kept both hands flat on the counter for a long, steady moment, and she breathed. I know, she said, to the kitchen, to no one, to the ghost of a girl in a back garden catching leaves before they could fall. Then she began to make breakfast, and plan, and grieve, and all three at once, and the morning of July 31st moved forward into something that was not going to be like any morning that had come before it. Outside, on Privet Drive, the air had gone very still. The sparrows had stopped arguing. The Thompsons' cat had gotten down from the fence post and retreated to the garden shed, and the clouds, which had been pale and harmless and summer grey, had begun, very slowly, to gather. Somewhere in Scotland, in a castle perched above a Scottish loch, 17 wardlines began to go dark. And Albus Dumbledore, sitting behind his desk in the first light of morning, looked up from his correspondence with an expression no one had ever seen on his face, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not certain what to do next. Chapter 2, 22 Broken Promises. The wardlines didn't go all at once. That was the thing that made it worse. If they'd gone simultaneously, all 17 at once in a single cascading failure, Dumbledore might have dismissed it as an attack, might have reached for the most obvious explanation and started mobilizing defenses. He was very good at mobilizing defenses. He had been doing it for 60 years. There was a comfort in it, a clarity of purpose, that he'd come to rely on more than he would have admitted to anyone. But they didn't go all at once. They went one at a time, at intervals of approximately 3.5 minutes, and that was what made him go very still behind his desk and set down his correspondence and fold his hands and simply watch as the ward map on the eastern wall, a living thing, threads of copper and gold charmed to trace the castle's defensive layers, began, quietly and methodically, to go dark. He had 17 wardlines attached to external sources. Most people who studied Hogwarts defenses didn't know that. Most people who studied Hogwarts defenses saw a vast, self-sustaining magical ecosystem that had grown organically over 1,000 years, and they were not wrong, that was accurate, as far as it went. But Dumbledore had, over his tenure as headmaster, supplemented and strengthened and in some cases rebuilt sections of the ward structure that had genuinely needed reinforcement, and some of that supplementation had required external power sources. He had been, at the time, dealing with a war. He had made decisions that a headmaster in peacetime would not have made. He stood by those decisions. He had stood by them for 10 years. He watched the fourth ward line go dark and felt the specific cold of a man who has told himself a thing so many times he has stopped examining whether the thing is true. Headmaster. Minerva McGonagall was standing in the doorway of his office. She had come in without knocking, which meant she'd felt it too. McGonagall had a sensitivity to the castle's magic that rivaled his own. She was in her dressing gown, her hair loose, which he had seen perhaps 3 times in 40 years, and her face was doing the particular thing it did when she was being very controlled about something she was furious about. "I felt the wards," she said. "Yes. Ward 7 just went. That's the perimeter detection. I know what Ward 7 is, Minerva." She crossed the room and stood in front of his desk and looked at the ward map on the wall, and he watched her count the dark lines. Her lips moved slightly. She turned back to him when she reached the end of the count, and her expression had gone somewhere he hadn't seen it go before, somewhere past controlled fury into something colder and more deliberate. "Those aren't Hogwarts wards," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "The perimeter detection ward, the foundation identity charm, the deep basin anchors, those aren't native to the castle. I've thought for years they felt different. I told myself I was imagining it." She paused. "I wasn't imagining it." "No," Dumbledore said. "You were not. Where did they come from?" He was quiet. She leaned forward slightly, both hands on the desk, and she looked at him directly with those sharp eyes that had never missed anything in 4 decades of teaching, and she asked the question not as a colleague asking for information but as a woman who already knows the answer and is giving the man in front of her one chance to say it himself. "Albus. Where did they come from?" "They came," he said, "from a blood contract. One that I believed had gone dormant." "Believed?" "Had reason to believe." She straightened up. She looked at the ward map again. 3 more lines had gone dark since she'd walked in. A blood contract doesn't go dormant. A blood contract either runs or it doesn't. You of all people know that. It had gone unactivated for 10 years. The principal activator was dead. I assessed the probability of activation as low enough to use, she said, and there was nothing in her voice when she said it, no heat, no accusation, just the flat fact of it, and that was somehow worse than shouting. He looked at her. I was fighting a war, Minerva. You were fighting a war, she agreed. And then you won it. And then you had 10 years of peace and you did not put those protections back. Silence. Ward line 12 went dark on the map. Dumbledore felt it, physically, a small absence, like a tooth that had been sensitive for so long you'd stop noticing the ache until it was suddenly not there anymore. He had grown so accustomed to the subtle supplementation of the castle's power that he hadn't noticed how much he'd come to rely on it. How much the wards had been drawing from the contract rather than from their own ancient foundations. Whose contract? McGonagall asked. He did not answer immediately. Albus. Her voice cracked across his name like something precise and hard. Whose contract? Lily Potter's, he said. The silence this time was different. It had a texture to it. McGonagall walked to the window. She stood with her back to him and looked out at the lake, still gray in the early morning, the mountains beyond it going from black to blue to the first pale suggestion of green as the sun came up, and she stood like that for long enough that 3 more ward lines went dark on the map behind her. When she turned around, her face was the face of someone who has made a decision. I'm going to ask you one question, she said. And I need you to answer it without strategy. Without the long view, without the greater good, without everything you tell yourself about the necessities of war and the requirements of protection. Just answer it directly. He waited. Did Harry Potter, she said, grow up with fewer protections than his mother built for him? Because you took them? The ward map behind him had gone from 17 active lines to 6. The remaining 6 were pulsing, not the steady glow of healthy wards but something fitful and contracting, like a flame in a wind it can't quite fight. Yes, Dumbledore said. McGonagall closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them, and she picked up her tartan dressing gown, turned it into robes with a movement so practiced it barely qualified as a gesture, and walked to the office door. I have 23 owls to send, she said. Legal. Protective. And one to the Longbottoms, because they had a blood contract as well and I want to know if theirs is intact. She paused with her hand on the door. I will not be used against that boy, Albus. Whatever you're planning to do in the next hour, be aware that I am not available to do it. She left. The last 6 ward lines were failing. Dumbledore sat alone in his office and watched them go, one after another, quiet and inevitable as lights being turned off in a house where no one lives anymore, and he thought about Lily Evans, the girl who had sat in his office at 17 to tell him she was declining the apprenticeship he'd offered because she wanted to work in blood magic, and he had said, gently and with genuine regret, that blood magic was a narrow field with limited application and she might want to consider the broader possibilities that a position with him would offer. She had smiled at him. That particular smile she had, the one that meant she'd already made her decision and the conversation was a courtesy. I appreciate that, Professor, she had said. But I know what I want to work on. He had underestimated her. He had done it when she was alive and, apparently, he had done it when she was dead, and the ward map on his wall was the evidence of it, a masterwork of blood magic that had been quietly, patiently, methodically reclaiming what was its for the past 62 minutes, immune to his intervention because you could not argue with a blood contract, you could not out-strategize it, you could not explain to it the necessities of war. Blood magic did not negotiate. It audited. The last ward line went dark at 7:43 in the morning. The castle felt different. He hadn't expected that, had expected to feel diminished, depleted, the specific anxiety of knowing the wards were operating on older, thinner power. What he felt instead was something more uncomfortable than that. He felt the castle as it actually was, without the supplementation, without the borrowed power, and it was not weak. It was old and stubborn and deep-rooted and entirely itself, and the protections he'd added from Lily's contract had been, he understood now, redundant. The castle hadn't needed them. He had taken them because they were there, because the magic was extraordinary and the opportunity was available, and he had told himself it was for the greater good, and the greater good had been, in this case, a comfortable story he'd told himself about an 11-year-old boy. He picked up a quill. He looked at a blank piece of parchment for a long time. Then he began to write. At number 4, Privet Drive, Harry was eating toast. This was remarkable primarily because Petunia had made it for him without being asked, had set it in front of him at the kitchen table with butter already on it and a cup of tea beside it, and had then sat across from him with her own tea and the 23 pages of Lily's contract spread between them like a map of something they'd both been navigating blind. Vernon Dursley was still asleep. Dudley was still asleep. The house was quiet in the particular way of a house where most of its occupants don't know yet that the morning has already changed the shape of their lives. Harry was on his third piece of toast and his second read-through of the contract's second section, the part Lily had written about what the protections actually did, the mechanics of them, and he kept pausing on the same passage. The fourth protection is what I'm calling an identity anchor. It's tied to your magical core, not to any external structure, and what it does is, there's no clean way to say this, so I'll just say it, it makes sure you know yourself. Not in a philosophical sense. In a literal magical sense. Your core has a signature, like a fingerprint, and the anchor makes sure nothing external can overwrite it or suppress it. Dark compulsions, foreign enchantments, systematic attempts to shape your magical development away from what you naturally are, the anchor resists them. I built it to be subtle, because subtle things last. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly keeps you you. He put the page down. He picked it up again. She wrote this when she was pregnant, he said. Petunia looked up. Some of it. She started planning it earlier. She was 19 when the war really started. 21 when she had you. He was quiet for a moment, holding the toast he'd forgotten to eat. She built me 22 protections before I was born. One of them is specifically designed to make sure no one can make me into something I'm not. He paused. That's not, most mums don't do that, do they? Most mums, Petunia said dryly, were not Lily Evans. He almost smiled. She watched him not quite smile and thought about the fourth protection, the identity anchor, and wondered whether the last 10 years would have been different if it had been allowed to function properly instead of being siphoned off to anchor something at Hogwarts. Whether the boy sitting across from her eating toast might have been, louder, perhaps. More certain. Less inclined to make himself small in rooms where Vernon was present. She thought she probably already knew the answer to that. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to go to Gringotts, she said, which was a sentence she had never in her life expected to say. Your mother's letter explains the process. The contract, now that it's fully activated and the audit's complete, generates what she called a record of claim, a legal document in blood magic terms that lists everything the contract covers, everything that was compromised, and everything that's been restored. Gringotts holds those records. They're the bankers, but they're also the oldest record keepers in magical Britain. I need to get there before, she stopped. Before Dumbledore does, Harry finished. She met his eyes. He was not asking it with fear. He was asking it the way you ask a question when you're running calculations. What's the timeline? What's the priority? What do we do first? It was, she thought, a remarkably clear-headed 11-year-old. Before anyone who wants to manage this situation gets ahead of it, she said carefully. Harry drank his tea. You said something official received a report. Automatic, from the audit. Yes. Your mother built that in. She said, here, Petunia found page 14. She said the audit results would file automatically with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and the Office of Magical Contracts. Both of them. Simultaneously. The moment the audit completed. So it's already out there. It's already out there. He absorbed this. Who runs the Department of Magical Law Enforcement? A woman called Amelia Bones, as of the last time I had any information about the magical world, which admittedly was some years ago. Harry looked at the contract pages between them. Is she honest? Petunia thought about this. Your mother mentioned her. Once, years ago. She said Bones was the kind of person who made the law feel like it was worth having. She paused. I took that to mean yes. He nodded. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. I felt something this morning. When the audit finished. I don't know what happened exactly, but something came back that I didn't know was gone. She waited. It felt like waking up. He frowned at his toast, looking for the right words. Not all the way. But like the first breath in the morning, that feeling of, oh, right. This is what I'm like. He glanced up, slightly self-conscious. I know how that sounds. It doesn't sound strange at all, she said. That's the identity anchor. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, has anything felt different to you? About me? Before today versus right now? She looked at him. At the steadiness in his face, the directness of the question, the way he held her gaze without aggression but without apology either. Last night, if she was being honest, and she had decided she was going to be honest now, might as well start today. Last night this boy had eaten dinner with his eyes on his plate and said nothing unless Vernon spoke to him first and been, in all visible ways, a child navigating a house that tolerated his presence on good days. This morning he was asking her direct questions and eating toast she'd made for him and reading his dead mother's blood contract with the focused engagement of someone taking an inventory. Same boy. Same kitchen. Same green eyes. Not the same quality of presence. Yes, she said. He nodded, as though that confirmed something. He didn't say I knew it or Dumbledore or anything sharp. He just nodded and turned back to the pages and kept reading. Petunia looked at the clock. It was 7:30. She needed to wake Vernon before this got further out of hand, not because she wanted his input, she decidedly did not want his input, but because she knew from long experience that surprising Vernon Dursley was never an efficient strategy, and she needed to get to London, and she needed to somehow get an 11-year-old to Gringotts, and she did not know how Gringotts worked or how to get into the magical world's banking district, and the letter had not fully explained. The doorbell rang. Not a knock. The actual doorbell, the normal Westminster chime doorbell that went off when someone pressed the button on the front porch, which was entirely ordinary except for the fact that it was 7:20 in the morning and nobody in Privet Drive rang doorbells at 7:20 in the morning, and the air in the kitchen went tight in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary anxiety. Harry was already on his feet. Petunia stood, gathered the contract pages, and folded them with the speed of someone who has spent 10 years keeping things hidden. She tucked them into the pocket of her dressing gown, they fit easily, which they shouldn't have, the pages clearly occupying more space dimensionally than they did physically, something she decided to think about later, and she went to the hallway. The figure on the other side of the frosted glass panel of the front door was not tall. It was, if anything, slightly shorter than average, and very still. She opened the door. The woman on the front step was in her mid-40s, with close-cropped dark hair, square-framed spectacles, and the kind of face that looked like it had never entertained a nonsensical thought in its life. She was wearing Muggle clothes, or rather, she was wearing what someone does when they know what Muggle clothes are but doesn't wear them often, a dark blazer over a buttoned shirt, trousers with a precise crease, shoes that were sensible to the point of being a statement. She had a leather satchel under one arm and a badge case in her hand, which she opened with the efficient click of someone accustomed to needing to prove themselves quickly. Mrs. Dursley, the woman said. My name is Amelia Bones. I'm the director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She glanced briefly at Harry, standing 2 steps behind Petunia, and her expression, controlled and professional, moved through something that might have been the start of a complicated emotion before she reined it in. I received a contract audit filing 40 minutes ago. I came directly. May I come in? Petunia stepped aside without hesitation. Amelia Bones walked in. She looked at the hallway, the perfectly ordinary hallway, photographs of Dudley at every age, coat hooks, umbrella stand, the cupboard under the stairs with the cot still visible through the ajar door, and her gaze stopped on the cupboard and stayed there for a moment that was a fraction too long. The kitchen, Petunia said. They went to the kitchen. Petunia put the kettle on because putting the kettle on was the only sane response to anything. Harry sat at the table with the quality of stillness he'd maintained all morning, watching Amelia Bones the way Petunia imagined he watched everything, taking inventory. Bones set her satchel on the table and opened it. She pulled out a folder, not parchment, a proper Muggle folder, which told Petunia she had prepared for this visit specifically, and set it open on the table. Inside were pages of what looked like dense printed text, but when she looked closer Petunia could see the copper thread lines running through them. Copies of the audit. I want to be clear about why I came personally and why I came immediately, Bones said. She looked at Harry. Mr. Potter. I knew your mother. Not well, she worked in a field I had professional overlap with. Blood contracts fall partly under magical law enforcement jurisdiction, but I knew her work. I knew what she was capable of. When I received this filing this morning, I read it in full on the apparition point before I came here, and I want you to know that everything it documents is going to be investigated. Harry said nothing. He was looking at her with those green eyes, taking her measure. Is it going to be investigated because the law requires it, he said, or because you want to investigate it? Bones looked at him for a moment. Then something in her face shifted, not softened, exactly, but recognized. Both, she said. Which is the only acceptable answer. He nodded once. Okay. Petunia poured tea. She set cups down. She sat. What does the investigation look like? Bones turned to her. The audit filing under blood contract law is treated as prima facie evidence. That means the court doesn't require us to prove the contract is authentic before we act on it. A blood contract is its own proof. What the filing generates automatically is a legal hold on any property or agreements connected to the contract, a mandatory review of any institutions named in the audit. She paused, and her voice changed fractionally on the next words, and a suspension of the authority of any individual named as responsible for the redirections, pending investigation. Silence. He's been suspended? Petunia asked. His authority over matters connected to this contract has been suspended. Which includes, Bones looked at a page in her folder, his legal designation as Harry Potter's magical guardian. His authority over Hogwarts wards connected to the contract. And any standing he has in the Wisengamot in matters that touch on blood contract law, which is a considerable reach, it turns out. Harry was very still. He's my magical guardian? Was, Bones said. As of 43 minutes ago. He absorbed this. Did my parents appoint him that? He asked. No, Bones said, and her voice had a precision to it that felt like a scalpel. They did not. Your parents named Sirius Black as your godfather and magical guardian. Mr. Black was arrested in November 1981 and never tried, a legal oversight that is, I'll tell you plainly, something I have been attempting to address for 3 years through channels that have been significantly impeded. She did not say by whom. She didn't have to. The designation of Dumbledore as your guardian was made by him unilaterally in December 1981, in a Wisengamot session I was not present for, approved by a quorum that he largely controlled. The kitchen was very quiet. So Sirius Black, Harry said. His voice was entirely level. He's still in prison. He is in Azkaban, yes. Without a trial. Without a trial. Harry looked at his hands. Then at Petunia. Then back at Bones. Can you fix that? Bones took a breath, not a hesitant breath, a breath that was more like the intake before a statement of intent. The contract audit, she said, triggers what is called a cascade review under blood magic law. That means any legal matter that the named individual, Dumbledore, had material influence over during the period of the contract violation is subject to automatic review. Sirius Black's imprisonment falls squarely within that period and within that influence. I've already sent a request to the prison for a status review. She paused. That's moving as fast as it legally can. How fast is that? Petunia asked. Days, not weeks. Possibly faster, depending on what the review turns up. Bones folded her hands on the table. Mrs. Dursley. I need to ask you some questions about the living conditions here, based on what the contract audit suggests about Harry's circumstances over the past 10 years. Petunia looked at her. She thought about the cupboard door. The thin cot. The locks, there had been locks at one point. She'd let Vernon do that and she'd told herself it was necessary and she had not been honest and she had already decided today was the day that was going to change. You can ask, Petunia said. I'll tell you the truth. Bones opened her folder to a clean page and picked up a pen, a Muggle pen. She clearly came prepared, and she began, and Petunia answered, and Harry sat at the kitchen table and listened to his aunt describe the last 10 years with an honesty that was clearly costing her something but from which she did not flinch, and he did not interrupt and he did not show anything on his face, and the morning moved past 8 o'clock and toward 9 and the light in the kitchen went from pale gold to the brighter, cleaner gold of a July morning fully established. Upstairs, Vernon's alarm went off. He turned it off. Dudley could be heard demanding his breakfast. Neither of them came downstairs, because when Vernon had reached the top of the stairs and looked down at the hallway and seen a stranger in the kitchen with his wife and that boy, something in his expression had shuddered and he had retreated, and Petunia had heard his footsteps going back down the hall to Dudley's room, and she'd thought, that's fine. That's actually fine. At 8:15, Amelia Bones paused in her notes and looked at Harry directly. I want to ask you something, she said. And it's not a legal question, so you're not obligated to answer. Harry met her eyes. Your mother built you 22 protections, Bones said. 17 were compromised. You've had them returned this morning. I want to know, and I'm asking because it matters for how I write the impact assessment, whether you can feel the difference. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands again, that quiet inventorying gesture she was coming to recognize. Then he spread his fingers flat on the table and looked at them, and Petunia saw it again, that faint ambient warmth, the light in the room turning slightly toward his hands, unhurried and natural, the way it turns toward open windows. Yes, he said. I can feel it. What does it feel like? He thought for a moment. Like remembering, he said finally. Like when you've got a word right on the tip of your tongue and then it comes, not something new. Something yours that you lost track of. Bones wrote that down. She wrote it down carefully, in a way that suggested she was going to quote it exactly. Good, she said quietly. That goes in the report. Outside on Privet Drive, 2 things happened in quick succession. The first was an owl, a large, purposeful, school owl kind of owl, landing on the kitchen windowsill with an envelope in its talons. The second was a crack of apparition from the back garden, sharp and clean, that made the kitchen window rattle. Harry was on his feet before the crack had finished echoing. Petunia was behind him. Bones had her wand in her hand. She held up one finger, wait, and she went to the back door and opened it. The man in the back garden was tall, angular, with the kind of face that looked like it had been through something and come out the other side with a grim, specific humor about it. He was wearing clothes that were slightly too large for him, recently acquired, clearly, not his own, and his dark eyes moved around the garden with the constant peripheral awareness of someone who had not felt safe in a very long time. He had the gaunt look of someone recently freed from somewhere terrible, but he was standing very straight. He looked at Bones. He looked past her into the kitchen. He looked at Harry. And the grim humor on his face broke open into something enormous and aching and real. "Merlin," he said, in a voice that was rough from disuse. "You look exactly like him. You look exactly like James. You've got," he stopped. Swallowed. "You've got her eyes." Harry stared. "Sirius Black," Bones said, and her voice had something in it that wasn't just professional acknowledgement, something that might have been relief, or the closest thing to it she permitted herself. "The review came through faster than I expected." "2 Aurors and a legal observer," Black said, without looking away from Harry. "They were very efficient. Apparently when a blood contract cascade review cites your case, things move." His voice was dry, but his eyes were still doing that enormous, aching thing. "I've been in Azkaban for 10 years, kid. I don't know what you've been told about me." "Nothing," Harry said. Black's jaw tightened. "Nothing." "Nothing," Harry confirmed. His voice was entirely calm. "Which means I'm working with what I can see." Black looked at him, really looked, the way adults don't always look at 11-year-olds, with genuine attention and respect for the fact that there was a full person in front of him. "What do you see?" he asked. Harry looked at him steadily for a long moment. "Someone who's been waiting a long time," he said, "and came here first." The morning was full and bright and moving fast, and in Scotland, Albus Dumbledore was writing a letter he'd started 4 times and set aside, and somewhere in the legal apparatus of the magical world 17 pieces of documentation were being stamped and filed and cross-referenced, and in the kitchen of number 4, Privet Drive, Sirius Black, freed by blood magic law, freed by Lily Evans's careful fury, freed 10 years late, looked at his godson and said, with the voice of a man deciding something, right then. "We've got a lot to talk about." "We do," Harry said. He pulled out a chair. Chapter 3, The Boy Who Wasn't Unprotected. Sirius Black drank 3 cups of tea in 20 minutes and ate everything Petunia put in front of him without seeming to notice he was eating, which told Harry something about what 10 years in Azkaban did to a person's relationship with food. He ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent a decade not being sure what the next meal looked like, and between bites he talked, and the talking was the same, focused, efficient, like a man who had stored up 10 years of words and was letting them out carefully so as not to waste any. Amelia Bones stayed. Harry had half expected her to leave once Sirius arrived. She'd done what she came to do, gotten her interview with Petunia, verified the contract, but she stayed at the kitchen table with her folder and her muggle pen and her tea gone cold, listening with the quality of attention that Harry was beginning to understand was just her default mode. She didn't take notes on everything Sirius said. Only some of it. The parts she wrote down were the parts that had dates attached. Petunia had gone upstairs to deal with Vernon, which Harry was grateful for because it was a conversation he didn't want to be present for and she hadn't asked him to be. So it was the 3 of them, Harry, Sirius, and Bones, in the kitchen in the bright July morning, and Sirius was talking about James. He'd have been unbearable about this, by the way, Sirius said, gesturing vaguely at Harry. He used to say, when Lily was pregnant, he'd say, "Pads, what if the kid gets my hair but Lily's magic, what do you do with something like that?" And I always said, "James, your magic is fine," and he'd say, "It's fine, Sirius, hers is extraordinary, there's a difference," and I always thought he was underselling himself, but, he looked at Harry, watching what happened this morning, those protections coming back, the way the magic moved, "You felt it?" Harry asked. "Felt it from the apparition point in Little Whinging when I landed. Couldn't have missed it. Like walking into a room where someone just opened all the windows at once." He paused. "She did it, didn't she? She actually finished it. The contract. She'd been working on it since before you were born. I knew about it, she told me, because she needed someone to know in case anything happened to her. James didn't know. She didn't want him to worry." He turned his mug around in his hands. "She made me swear not to tell him, which was the single hardest thing she ever asked me to do, and I've done some difficult things for Lily Evans." A small, complicated smile. She kept saying it's not that I don't trust him, Sirius, it's that I trust him to try to help, and if he tries to help he'll put himself in danger and I can't." He stopped. She couldn't lose him. She knew she'd lose him anyway. She knew it was coming. Harry watched him say this. Watched the way he moved through the words like navigating known terrain in the dark. He'd been over this ground 1,000 times, 10 years in Azkaban with nothing to do but go over it. "She didn't lose you," Harry said. "You lost her." Sirius looked at him. "Yeah," he said, quietly. "Yeah, that's it exactly." "What happened that night?" Harry asked. "After," he paused, because there was no clean way to phrase "after my parents were murdered," so he just let the sentence end where it ended. Bones looked up from her folder but didn't intervene. Sirius set down his mug. He had the look of someone deciding how much of a thing to say, but Harry saw the moment he decided against the edited version. "Dumbledore told me where you were. The night of, that night. He came to the house, to Godric's Hollow, before the Aurors got there, and when I got there he was already standing in the street and he had you. He'd picked you up from the rubble and he was holding you and you had that cut on your forehead and you were crying, which meant you were alive, which was the only thing that mattered for about 30 seconds. He breathed out. Then he told me he was taking you to your mother's sister. I told him I was your godfather. I told him James and Lily had signed the paperwork, I was your magical guardian, we'd done it properly through Gringotts and everything. He said," a pause, "he said it was done. That the arrangements had been made. That it was for the greater good. And then? And then I went after Peter Pettigrew." Bones's pen stopped moving. "Peter Pettigrew," she said, with a very specific kind of neutrality. "The actual secret keeper," Sirius said, looking at her directly. James and Lily switched at the last minute. "My idea, actually. I thought I was the obvious target and Peter was beneath notice." Which was, his mouth twisted, accurate, as it turned out, just not in the way I meant it. "He gave them to Voldemort and then he faked his own death and framed me for it, and I chased him into a Muggle street and he blew up 12 people and cut off his own finger and turned into a rat and went into the sewer, and when the Aurors arrived I was the one standing there." A flat, exhausted clarity in his voice. "I laughed. I don't know why I laughed. It was just, the scale of it. The completeness of it. I think shock does things to you." "No one investigated," Bones said. "It wasn't a question. Bartemius Crouch Sr. authorized the arrest without a hearing. Dumbledore declined to testify on my behalf. I was in Azkaban inside a week." He looked at his hands. "I used to think Dumbledore genuinely believed I was guilty. It took me until maybe year 4 to work out that he might have found it convenient that I was out of the way. No one asking inconvenient questions about Harry's living situation." Bones was writing very fast. Harry had been listening to all of this with the same still attention he'd maintained all morning, but his hands had moved, both flat on the table, fingers spread, and the warmth was there again, steady and unhurried. Not anger, exactly. Something more concentrated than anger. Anger moved outward, this felt like it moved inward and downward, settling into the bones. "He's going to come here," Harry said. Sirius glanced at him. "Dumbledore? He knows the contract activated. He watched the ward lines go at Hogwarts. McGonagall was probably with him when it happened." He looked at Bones. "When you suspended his authority as my guardian, how was that communicated to him?" "Formal notification by owl, sent at the same time I operate here," Bones said. "So he knows you're here?" "Yes. And he knows Sirius is out. The review notification would have gone to his office automatically. He was listed as a material witness in the original case." Bones paused. "He'll know." Harry looked at Sirius. Sirius was watching him with an expression that had moved past the enormous aching recognition from the garden and into something more present, more alert. Like a man realizing the kid in front of him was not going to need protecting in the way he'd assumed. "What are you thinking?" Sirius asked. "I'm thinking we don't wait for him to manage it," Harry said. "He's good at managing things. He's been doing it for decades. The longer we sit here and let him frame what happened, the more room he has to work with." He looked at Bones. "The contract audit, you said the findings are already filed. Can anyone change that?" "No. Blood contract filings are immutable. They go into Gringotts' permanent record the moment the audit completes. And the suspension of his authority, also immutable without a full Wisengamot hearing." "When's the hearing?" "I'd be pushing for within the week." Harry nodded. Something in the set of his shoulders was very settled. "I want to be there." Bones looked at him steadily. "You're 11 years old. I'm the subject of the contract," he said. "And the victim of the documented violations. Is there a legal reason I can't attend?" A pause. "No," she said. "In blood contract proceedings, the subject has standing to attend and address the court." "Then I'll be there." Sirius made a sound that was half a laugh and entirely involuntary. He covered it with a cough and looked at the ceiling. "Right," he said. "Right, okay. You are exactly like both of them simultaneously, and it is frankly alarming." The owl that had landed on the kitchen windowsill during Sirius's arrival had been sitting there for the better part of 40 minutes, its letter untouched, with the resigned patience of a school owl accustomed to humans taking their time. Harry finally took the letter. It was from Hogwarts, the standard admissions letter, thick creamy envelope, emerald green ink, Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, number 4, Privet Drive. He looked at the address for a moment. "Is it the letter?" Sirius asked. "Yeah." "Open it. You've already had a significantly more eventful morning than most first years get, might as well." Harry opened it. He read the standard letter, the invitation, the term dates, the list of required equipment, and then he read the list of books and supplies, and then he turned the envelope over and found a second, smaller envelope inside, sealed with a different seal. Not Hogwarts. Something older. He broke it and read it. His expression didn't change, but his eyes got slightly brighter, not with emotion, with interest. "What is it?" Petunia asked, from the doorway. She'd come back downstairs. She was dressed properly now, in grey trousers and a pale blue blouse, her hair neat. She looked, Harry thought, more like herself than she had in years. He wasn't sure why he thought that, only that it was true. He read the smaller letter aloud. "Mr. Potter. I am the Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Under normal circumstances I would accompany a Muggle-raised student on their first visit to Diagon Alley to acquire their school supplies. Under current circumstances, which you are no doubt already aware of, I am coming to collect you myself, today, if you're willing. I will be at number 4, Privet Drive at 11 o'clock. If this is not convenient, send the owl back with a note. I would also like to say, in whatever small way this letter allows, I am sorry. Some things were not in my power to prevent. Some things were. I did not always distinguish clearly enough between them. Professor M. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress." Silence. "She's honest," Petunia said, after a moment. "Or she's smart enough to be honest now that the contract's gone off," Sirius said. He wasn't being mean about it. He was being accurate. She knew something was wrong. She's known for years. The question is what she did with that knowledge. "She sent 23 owls this morning," Bones said quietly. "I received one of them. She's been moving since the ward lines went." "That's something," Sirius allowed. Harry was looking at the letter. He was looking at the word sorry specifically, the shape of it on the page, the way it sat between the two sentences around it, not buried, not qualified, just there. He thought about what it took to write a word like that to an 11-year-old you'd never met, and what it meant that she'd done it. "I'll see her," he said. "11th's fine." Vernon came downstairs at 9:30. Harry had gone to wash up and get dressed, and Sirius had been set up in the living room with another cup of tea and a plate of toast that he was getting through methodically, and Bones was on the phone. She had produced a mobile phone from her satchel with the ease of someone who'd learned Muggle communication methods as a professional necessity, talking to someone about case documentation, her voice low and precise. So it was Petunia in the kitchen when Vernon appeared in the doorway in his work trousers and shirt sleeves, taking in the used cups and the folder on the table and the sound of a woman's voice on a phone in his living room. "Petunia," he said. The warning in his voice was the texture of ground glass. "Good morning, Vernon," she said. She didn't turn from the washing up. "Who is that woman? What is she doing in our—" "She's from the government," Petunia said. "She's here about Harry." "About the—" he lowered his voice. "About his thing?" "Yes." "Then it's none of our— it is, actually." She turned around. She had the expression she used in parent-teacher conferences, the one that Vernon had learned years ago meant she'd made a decision and the conversation was for his benefit, not hers. His mother wrote a legal contract 10 years ago. It has some implications for this house and for Harry's situation here. The woman in the living room is investigating. Her name is Amelia Bones and she is the equivalent of a cabinet minister, and I need you to be civil. Vernon looked at her. He read her face the way a man reads weather, not always accurately but with long practice, and something in the set of her jaw told him something he clearly didn't know how to categorize, because his expression did several things in quick succession and landed on an uneasy, provisional quiet. "There's a man in the living room," he said. "That's Sirius Black. He's Harry's godfather. He was unavailable and now he's available." Vernon started. "He'll be staying for a while," Petunia said, and turned back to the washing up. The sound Vernon made was not a word. It was more the sound a man makes when the ground moves under him and he's deciding whether to pretend it didn't. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went and got his briefcase and his car keys and said, from the hallway, in a voice that was working very hard to be normal, "I'll be at the office." "All right," Petunia said. The front door closed. She breathed out. Harry came downstairs at 10 in clean jeans and a t-shirt, clothes that were too large, she noticed again, and felt the same sharp clarity she'd felt since the morning began, and he found Sirius in the living room going through a copy of the audit results that Bones had left on the coffee table, and the two of them sat together without apparent self-consciousness. Sirius with his long legs stretched out and Harry cross-legged on the other end of the sofa, and Harry asked questions and Sirius answered them, and Petunia stood in the doorway for a moment before they noticed her and watched the shape of it. What struck her was that Sirius talked to Harry the way adults almost never talk to children, as though the child's questions were serious questions that deserved serious answers. Not simplified, not managed, not redirected toward age-appropriate content. He answered what was asked. When Harry asked about Peter Pettigrew, Sirius told him. When Harry asked about Voldemort, about the specific mechanics of what Voldemort had wanted and why Harry's birth had mattered, Sirius explained it without softening the edges. When Harry asked why Dumbledore had been allowed to operate without oversight for so long, Sirius was quiet for a moment and then said, honestly, power. Not dark power. Just, accumulated trust. The kind that builds up over decades until people stop questioning the person who holds it because it feels disloyal to question someone who's done so much good. That's more dangerous than dark power, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. Yeah, he said. I think that's right. Harry turned a page of the audit. He built his whole strategy around me being weak, he said, with no particular heat. Not just unaware. Actively weak. The identity anchor, if that had been functioning, I'd have had a better grasp of what I was capable of. The knowledge protections, if those had been intact, I'd have been harder to keep in the dark. He didn't just take my mother's magic to power his wards. He took it because it was a convenient bonus that the protections most likely to make me dangerous to his plans went with it. Sirius was very still. You think it was intentional, he said. Not just opportunistic. I think a man smart enough to redirect a blood contract without triggering it for 10 years is smart enough to choose which protections to take, Harry said. Mum's letter says the love shield was untouchable. He couldn't take that one. So he took the ones around it. The ones that would have meant I knew what I was. A long pause. She named exactly what they were when she documented them, Petunia said from the doorway. They both looked at her. She walked in and sat in the armchair. She named them in the contract. Every one. The identity anchor, the knowledge protections, the heritage shields. She named them specifically, which means she anticipated they'd be the ones at risk. She knew what kind of protection would be most inconvenient for someone who wanted a controllable boy. Sirius ran a hand over his face. She saw it coming. She saw the possibility coming, Petunia said. She built safeguards. She just couldn't make them foolproof because she didn't know who specifically to safeguard against. So she made it so that when the contract activated, the audit would be specific enough that we'd know. She handed us the whole case, Harry said. Yes, Petunia said. She did. Harry looked at the audit results in his hands. He looked at them for a long time with an expression she couldn't quite read, not grief, not anger, something that contained both but was larger than either of them, something that was coming to terms with a thing that required considerable space. Then he put the pages down and looked at Sirius. Tell me about the magical world, he said. Not the history. I'll read history. Tell me, what it's like. What you need to know to move through it. The things they don't put in books. Sirius looked at him for a moment. Then he started talking, and he didn't stop until McGonagall arrived. She arrived at 5 to 11, precisely, which was itself a kind of statement. The knock on the front door was brisk, clean, 3 times, not timid and not aggressive, just clear. Harry answered it. Minerva McGonagall was tall, straight-backed, and wearing proper wizarding robes that made no concession to the Muggle street she was standing on. She had a small case in one hand and her wand in her other hand, not raised, just held, the way experienced witches and wizards sometimes carry their wands, like an extension of the hand, not as a weapon but as a fact about themselves. She looked at Harry. He looked at her. She had sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses, different from Bones's squared frames. These were severe and dark, and they did the same thing Bones's had done, that flicker of complicated emotion brought quickly under control, except on McGonagall's face it was larger and less contained, because McGonagall had known Lily and James as students and the face looking up at her was both of them at once and that was not a thing you could entirely manage. Mr. Potter, she said. Professor McGonagall, he said. A small pause. I wrote that I was sorry, she said. I meant it. I know, he said. Come in. She came in. She looked at the hallway with the same pausing attention Bones had given the cupboard door, and she breathed in through her nose and out again, and then she followed Harry to the kitchen where Petunia was and the living room doorway where Sirius appeared, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. Sirius, she said, with about 12 years of complicated feeling in 2 syllables. Minnie, he said. Don't, she said. Sorry. He didn't look sorry. He looked like a man who had found something to be amused by in this day and was going to hold on to it. You look well. I look as I always look. You look, she stopped. Looked at him properly. Something in her face went quiet in a way that wasn't coldness. You look like someone who shouldn't have been where you were. I wasn't supposed to be, he said. She looked at him steadily for a long moment. I know, she said. She stopped, then, I am sorry about that too. I didn't push as hard as I could have. You pushed at all? He asked, without accusation, genuinely asking. I raised it with Dumbledore in 1982, 1985, and 1989, she said. Each time he assured me the matter had been reviewed and was in hand. Sirius's expression moved through something. He nodded once and let it go, or let it go for now, which was the most anyone could ask for on a morning already this full. McGonagall turned to Harry. "I'd like to take you to Diagon Alley," she said. "Get your school things. I'll explain what I can on the way and answer what I can't explain with better answers than you've probably been given so far. Which admittedly isn't a high bar." "I already know quite a bit," Harry said. She glanced at Sirius. "I imagine you do." "Sirius is coming," Harry said. It wasn't a question. McGonagall looked at Sirius. Sirius met her gaze with the pleasant expression of a man who has already decided and is waiting to see if anyone argues. She did not argue. "Obviously," she said. "And my aunt," Harry said. McGonagall looked at Petunia. Petunia looked at McGonagall with the particular expression of a woman who has had an enormous morning and is not done having it. "I have questions about the contract," Petunia said. "About what it entitles Harry to. What he should have received that he didn't. I'd like to go to Gringotts." "Then we'll go to Gringotts," McGonagall said, with the decisiveness of a woman who, now that she'd committed to a course of action, was going to see it through at full speed. "Come on. All of you. The Leaky Cauldron is 20 minutes by car or 30 seconds by side-along, and I suspect Mr. Potter hasn't side-alonged before." "I haven't," Harry confirmed. "It is briefly unpleasant." "You'll be fine." She looked at him. "Are you ready?" Harry picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. He looked at Sirius. He looked at Petunia, who had her bag over her shoulder and Lily's contract in it and the expression of a woman who has decided something that does not expire. He looked at McGonagall. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." McGonagall extended her arm. He took it. And for the first time in his life, Harry Potter stepped sideways out of Privet Drive and into the world that had been waiting for him, and what he felt was not fear or wonder or overwhelm, it was the deep, clear, settling feeling of something that had been waiting to begin finally, at full tilt and with no further apology, beginning. Diagon Alley in July was brilliant and overwhelming, and Harry moved through it with Sirius at his left shoulder and McGonagall cutting a path ahead of him and Petunia on his right, keeping a particular, sharp-eyed quiet that he understood now was how she processed things she hadn't expected. People looked at him. Specifically, people looked at his forehead, and he knew why, and he let them look because he wasn't going to spend energy managing other people's reactions to a scar he'd had since he was a year old. Sirius watched the people looking and moved slightly closer. Not protectively, or not only protectively. More like a person taking up space deliberately, the way you stand in a doorway to make clear the room beyond is occupied. They went to Gringotts first because Petunia had the contract and because Gringotts was where the records were and because Harry had a vault he'd never seen. The goblins received them with the particular Gringotts efficiency that did not perform warmth but did perform absolute competence, and when Petunia presented the contract and asked to speak with someone in the Records and Claims Division, they were taken to a long office deep in the building where a goblin named Ragnok sat behind a desk the size of a small car and looked at the contract with an expression that moved through several things very quickly. He read the audit results. He read them twice. He set them down with enormous precision. "This contract was filed with Gringotts in October 1980, he said. At the time of filing, 22 protections were registered and active. The original depositor," he looked up, "was Lily Jane Potter, née Evans." "Yes," Petunia said. "We received the audit completion this morning at 6:57, Ragnok said. "We have been waiting for someone to arrive." He said this with the inflection of someone who has been waiting with a great deal of opinions about what they'd been waiting for. The vault associated with this contract, Vault 687, collateral holding for the contract's material component, has been sealed pending claimant presentation since 1981. You are the claimant, Mrs. Dursley, as named activator. What's in the vault? Harry asked. Ragnar looked at him. Goblins had very steady eyes. They looked at you the way old trees look at things, from a height of years, with an agenda you couldn't entirely read. Documents, he said. Additional correspondence. A second contract connected to the first. He paused, then, and a letter addressed to Harry James Potter, to be opened when the first contract activated. The room was very quiet. Harry looked at Ragnar. Let's go then, he said. They went. The vault was deep in the mountain, past the regular vaults, in a section that felt older and less traveled, and when Ragnar opened it with a key and a word in gobbledygook, it was not large, not like Harry's main vault, which he saw briefly, a golden cave of his parents' wealth, but it held what Ragnar had said it held, arranged in a dry, protected case. Documents. A second contract, smaller than the first, with a seal he didn't recognize. And an envelope. His name on it in green ink. Not the contract script. Lily's handwriting. He took it. He held it for a moment. Sirius was standing behind him and to the left, and he could feel the tension in the man without looking at him, the specific tension of someone who loved the person who wrote the letter and was trying very hard to let the moment belong to the person it was written for. Harry opened it. He read it standing in the vault with the goblin torch making gold light on the stone walls, and he read it to the end, and then he stood quietly for a moment and no one said anything. Then he looked up. She says, he said, and his voice was entirely level, that the second contract is between her and the magical world at large. Not between her and me. She says it's the one that makes the whole audit legally binding at every level, Wisengamot, Ministry, Gringotts, all of it simultaneously. She calls it the keystone. He looked at Petunia. She says you need to countersign it. You and me both. That was always the plan. She needed the Muggle world representative and the magical world subject to both confirm. Petunia looked at the second contract. At the seal. What does countersigning do? Ragnar answered before Harry could. It makes the audit irrevocable, he said. At every legal level. Simultaneously. It cannot be challenged, buried, delayed, or strategically reviewed into irrelevance. A pause. It is the kind of document that makes large institutions very uncomfortable. Good, Harry said. Petunia picked up the contract. She looked at it. She looked at the seal, and then she looked at Harry, and he looked back, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with blood magic and everything to do with a woman finally choosing the version of herself she should have been years ago. She countersigned it. Harry countersigned it. Ragnar took it without ceremony and said it would be registered within the hour. They walked out of the vault and back up through the mountain and out into the white marble lobby of Gringotts, and when they came through the doors onto the white stone steps and the brightness and noise of Diagon Alley hit them, Harry stopped for a moment and looked at the street, at the witches and wizards moving through it, at the owls overhead, at the old crooked buildings leaning together like friends, and he breathed. All right? Sirius asked, from his elbow. Yeah, Harry said. He sounded surprised by it. Yeah, I actually am. The Keystone contract was registered. The audit was irrevocable. Somewhere in the Ministry of Magic a notification was being generated. Somewhere in Scotland a man who had been very used to being the one who controlled the flow of information was finding out that 2 11-year-old children and a Muggle woman had just filed a document that superseded his ability to manage any of it. Harry started down the steps. Books first, he said. Then the rest of the list? Books first, McGonagall agreed, falling in beside him. And Mr. Potter. He looked at her. Welcome, she said quietly, to the world. He smiled at that. A real one, not managed, not polite. The smile of a boy who had been told all his life that he was nothing particular and had found out this morning that he was something very particular indeed, and had decided to be fine with that, and more than fine. Thanks, he said. I've been waiting. Chapter 4, Amelia Bones receives a file. The notification arrived at the Ministry of Magic at 11:47 in the morning, which was the exact moment Amelia Bones was standing in her office on the third floor eating a sandwich she'd forgotten she was holding and reading the secondary documentation from Gringotts that had come in on the heels of the Keystone contract registration. Her assistant, a young woman named Proudfoot who had been with her for 3 years and had the good sense to understand when something was significant, had put it on her desk with a yellow flag on it, which was their system for read this before anything else, including your sandwich. Bones had read it twice and was now looking at the wall above her desk where she kept a corkboard of active cases, and she was thinking. The Keystone contract changed the geometry of the situation. The original audit had been significant enough that she'd operate to privet drive herself at first light, which she didn't do for most cases, which her assistant had noted with the careful non-expression of someone who noted things and said nothing. But a blood contract audit, even a well-documented one, existed in a space where a sufficiently influential person could, over time, shape the response. Delay the hearing. Manage the witnesses. Have a very quiet word with the right Wisengamot members about the complexity of the situation, the historical context, the weight of what the man in question had contributed to magical Britain over 60 years. She knew how it worked. She'd watched it work. She'd spent 3 years trying to reopen Sirius Black's case through official channels and had hit a wall so smooth and so perfectly maintained that she'd started wondering whether it was a wall or just the shape of the room. The Keystone contract was not a wall she could hit. It was a document that hit back. It had registered simultaneously at Gringotts, at the Office of Magical Contracts, at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and, this was the part that had made her set down her sandwich, at the Wisengamot's own Clerk of Records. Automatically. By blood magic law that predated the Wisengamot itself. There was no motion to table. There was no committee to refer it to. The hearing was now legally mandatory within 5 working days, and the findings of the audit were entered into the official record as evidence before the hearing had even been scheduled. Albus Dumbledore was going to walk into that hearing room with the entire case already made against him. She pinned the Gringotts notification to her corkboard. She looked at it. She picked up her sandwich. There was a knock on the door. "Come," she said. What came through the door was not Proudfoot. It was Augustus Savage, head of the Auror office, a broad-shouldered man who wore his authority the way some men wear expensive watches, ostentatiously, and with the constant low anxiety of someone who knows it can be taken. He was in full Auror robes and he was carrying a file that was, by the thickness of it, at least 40 pages. Behind him, uninvited, was a man Bones had been expecting to see today, only not quite this soon. Albus Dumbledore closed her office door quietly behind him and stood near it with his hands folded, wearing robes of deep blue that were, she thought, extremely well chosen for today, not the dramatic purple or the silver-starred traveling ones but something quieter, more formal, the robes of a man presenting himself as reasonable. She chewed her sandwich. She swallowed. She set it down. "Albus," she said. "Amelia," he said. His voice was warm. Measured. The voice of a man who had spent 60 years learning that warmth and measure were more persuasive than volume or urgency. "I appreciate you seeing me. I didn't agree to see you. You came with Savage." Savage had the expression of a man who had been maneuvered and knew it and was going to have strong opinions about it later in private. "He asked to. I wanted to come to you directly," Dumbledore said, with the specific mildness that Bones recognized as a calibrated thing, mild in the same way a scalpel is thin. "Before this moves further through official channels, I believe it would benefit everyone to discuss the full context of what the audit documents." "The audit," she said, "documents what happened. That's what audits do." "It documents events," he said. "It does not document reasons. Blood contract audits are thorough but they are not nuanced. They record actions without recording the circumstances in which those actions were necessary." Bones looked at him. She had been looking at Albus Dumbledore in various professional contexts for 20 years, and she had spent most of that time navigating the particular difficulty of a man who was genuinely brilliant, genuinely dedicated to good outcomes, and genuinely accustomed to deciding alone what those outcomes should be. "Sit down, Albus," she said. He sat. Savage remained standing near the wall with his file, doing the calculation of which way to face. "I'm going to tell you what I have," Bones said. "And then you can tell me what you came to tell me, and I'll listen. I'll actually listen, not in the way where I appear to listen while preparing my counterargument. But I need you to hear something first." Dumbledore waited. "The Keystone contract was filed at 11:47, she said. 40 minutes ago. It went to the Wisengamot Clerk of Records. The hearing is mandatory and it's in the record. I can't unschedule it and neither can you, and if anyone tries to influence the clerk's scheduling, that action becomes part of the official record as potential interference with blood magic proceedings." She paused. "I'm telling you this not as a threat. I'm telling you this because the people you might normally speak to let them understand the broader picture, those conversations will now be documented. Blood magic law has very specific provisions about external influence on mandatory hearings." Something moved through Dumbledore's expression. Not panic. Something more controlled than that, the recognition of terrain, a man recalibrating where his footing was. "I see," he said. "Good. Now tell me what you came to tell me." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, elegant old hands, the right one scarred in a way she'd always been too professional to ask about. Then he looked up. "What I did," he said, "was wrong." She waited. "I have told myself for 10 years that the redirections were justified by necessity. That the war had depleted the castle's defenses and the children in my care required protection. That Harry Potter was safer at Privet Drive with the love shield intact than he would have been anywhere else, and therefore the additional protections were being put to better use than they would have been sitting dormant on a child living in a Muggle household." He paused. "All of those things are partially true." "Partial truth," she said, "is a very specific kind of dishonesty." "Yes," he said. "It is." He said it without deflection, and that surprised her enough that she held the moment carefully, examining it. "I am not here to argue my innocence, Amelia. I am here because I understand what this hearing will find, and I would prefer, for Harry's sake, not for mine, that the proceedings be conducted in a way that does not become a spectacle that damages the boy further." Bones looked at him for a long, even moment. "You're asking me to manage the hearing. I'm asking you to consider Harry's welfare in how you structure it. And I would take that consideration more seriously," she said, "if you had demonstrated, at any point in the last 10 years, that Harry's welfare was the primary factor in your structural decisions." She let that sit. "The boy is in Diagon Alley right now with his godfather, who should not have spent a day in Azkaban, and his aunt and Professor McGonagall, getting his school supplies. He seems, by all observable evidence, entirely capable of managing his own welfare." She picked up the Gringotts notification from the corkboard and held it up. "He countersigned the Keystone contract this morning at the age of 11. In Gringotts. Of his own volition. He understood what it did." Dumbledore looked at the document. His expression was complex. "He is extraordinary," he said quietly. "I always knew he would be." "Then you should have built extraordinary around him," she said. "Not manageable." Silence. Savage shifted against the wall. He was not, Bones noted, looking at Dumbledore with the deference he normally directed toward the headmaster. He was looking at him with the expression of a man revising a long-held opinion. "I want to ask you one thing," Bones said. "Directly." Dumbledore met her eyes. "Peter Pettigrew," she said. "You knew." A pause that was a fraction of a second too long. "I suspected," he said. "When?" "Late 1982. There were inconsistencies in the evidence from Godric's Hollow. Things that troubled me. And you said nothing. Sirius Black in Azkaban was, he stopped. Was convenient, she said. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He looked at his hands again, and in the silence of that non-answer, Amelia Bones arrived at the full, clean understanding of the man sitting across from her, not a villain, nothing so simple, but something in some ways more troubling. A man who had done genuine good and genuine harm with the same hands, using the same intelligence, and had never fully separated the two in his own accounting. I'll be filing additional charges, she said. Related to the Black case. Obstruction, at minimum. She stood up. The hearing is in 4 days. I would recommend you retain legal counsel, Albus. And I would recommend it be someone other than anyone you've appointed to anything. Dumbledore stood. He was very straight, very still. He looked suddenly, she thought, old, not frail. He was never frail. The man had more power in his left hand than most wizards had in their whole body, but old in the way that happens when the story you've been telling yourself stops holding. Amelia, he said, at the door. She looked at him. He had her eyes the first time I saw him, he said. Standing in the rubble. He had her eyes and he was crying and I thought, he stopped. I thought I understood what needed to be done. I thought I knew what the war required and what the peace required, and I believed I was making the only defensible choices. A pause. I am still not certain I was entirely wrong about the war. No, she said. You might not have been. About the war. She held his gaze. But you kept making war decisions in peacetime, Albus. And the person who paid for it was a child who was never a soldier. He left. Savage closed the door and stood in the resulting silence for a moment. Then he looked at Bones with the expression of a man who has just recalibrated something significant. I need that file, she said, pointing at the 40 pages he was still holding. He put it on her desk. He started to leave. Savage, she said. He stopped. Tell the Auror office that the Black case is now formally reopened. Full investigation. I want Pettigrew located, not just the finger, the actual man, wherever he's been for 10 years, and I want it treated as a priority. Peter Pettigrew's dead, Savage said. Peter Pettigrew, she said, had 12 years as an animagus and 1 less finger and is, I am increasingly certain, extremely not dead. Find him. Savage left with the expression of a man who had arrived expecting a routine morning and was leaving with considerably more to do. Bones sat down. She opened the 40-page file. She began to read. Madame Malkin's was the first place in Diagon Alley where Harry noticed it. Not the staring, he'd clocked the staring almost immediately when they'd come up the white steps of Gringotts and moved into the alley's main thoroughfare. People looked at his forehead the way people look at famous buildings when they pass them, with a kind of reflexive recognition that wasn't really about him, was about the story they'd been told, and he'd filed that away without distress because he had learned very young to catalogue what things were about and react accordingly. The thing he noticed in Madame Malkin's was different. It was what happened when people looked past the scar. He was standing on the fitting stool being measured by the cheerful, pins-between-teeth efficiency of Madame Malkin's assistant when a boy appeared on the stool beside his and started talking. Blonde, somewhat pointed in the face, with an expression of easy authority that suggested he'd never been in a room where he wasn't expected to be the most significant person. Hogwarts, the boy said. Yeah, Harry said. Same. The boy looked at him with the specific assessment of someone making social calculations at speed. Do you know what house you'll be in? My family's all been Slytherin, I expect I will be. Nothing wrong with Slytherin if you know the right sort. He glanced sideways with theatrical casualness. Suppose your family has opinions about that. My family, Harry said, is complicated. Who's your? The boy looked at the trio standing near the door, Sirius Black in slightly too large clothes with the grim, watching quality of a man readjusting to a world after a decade away from it, Petunia Desley in Muggle clothes looking at a display of robes with the expression of a woman determined to understand everything she's looking at, and Professor McGonagall standing beside her explaining something in a low precise voice. The boy's eyes moved between them and landed back on Harry with a recalibrated expression. "Is that who I think it is? McGonagall from Hogwarts?" "Yeah. And that man, that's not," he stopped. His expression did something complicated. "That's Sirius Black." "Yeah. A beat. He was in Azkaban. He got out this morning," Harry said. "He was innocent. He never had a trial." He said it pleasantly, like providing weather information. "Wrong place, wrong evidence, wrong politics." The boy was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of someone receiving information that rearranged other information he thought he'd had correctly sorted. Then he looked at Harry's forehead, properly, this time, not the reflex look but a deliberate one, and Harry watched him arrive at the conclusion the boy had clearly been building toward. "You're Harry Potter," the boy said. "Yeah," Harry said. "I'm Draco Malfoy." He said it with the specific emphasis of someone who expects the name to land. Harry considered this. He knew the name. Sirius had mentioned the Malfoys in the kitchen that morning, briefly, in the context of old pure-blood families and their various political alignments. The Malfoys, Sirius had said, are the kind of family who was very publicly for Voldemort until it became professionally inadvisable. He hadn't said it with particular heat. Just precision. "Nice to meet you," Harry said. Malfoy seemed slightly wrong-footed by the absence of a more significant reaction. He regrouped. "I could help you navigate things," he said. "Hogwarts. The families. Who matters, who doesn't? It's complicated if you don't know the right people." A pause. "I could introduce you." Harry looked at him. Malfoy was, under the performance of easy authority, doing something Harry recognized because he'd done versions of it himself, reaching for the dynamic he understood, because the dynamic he understood was the one where you established who was significant and who deferred and moved accordingly. It was what you did when you'd been raised in a house where those were the only coordinates that mattered. "That's decent of you," Harry said, genuinely. "But I'm fine. I've got people." He nodded toward the door. Sirius had spotted them talking and had moved slightly, not intrusively but with the subtle repositioning of someone making themselves available. McGonagall was looking at something on a shelf and not looking at Harry, which was itself a kind of attentiveness. Malfoy followed his gaze. Processed. Re-evaluated. The social calculation was happening visibly. "The Malfoys and the Blacks are related," Malfoy said, carefully, which was a significant change of tack. "I know," Harry said. "My father knows Sirius Black." "I imagine he does," Harry said. Malfoy looked at him again. Really looked, this time, with the calculation stripped back enough that Harry could see the actual boy under it, younger than the performance, more uncertain, operating on instincts that his upbringing had given him without much examination. He wasn't, Harry thought, terrible. He was a boy who'd been given a set of tools and told they were the only tools available. "Hogwarts will be interesting," Malfoy said, finally, which was both a withdrawal and an open question. "Yeah," Harry said. "I think it probably will." Madame Malkin's assistant called for a turn, and the conversation ended, and Malfoy's faint frown as he looked at his own measurements suggested he was doing further recalculating that would occupy him for some time. Flourish and Blots had a problem. The problem was that someone, Harry didn't know who, but the display in the window and the hand-lettered sign beside it suggested it had been arranged with enthusiasm, had set up a small, tasteful arrangement of books called The Boy Who Lived, the story of Harry Potter right next to the Hogwarts first-year reading list. There was a stack of them. There was a photograph on the cover. The photograph showed a baby version of Harry, which was uncomfortable, and a subtitle that read the full story of his survival and his place in wizarding history. Harry stood in front of the window and looked at it. "That exists," he said. Several versions of it exist, McGonagall said, from behind him, with the flat tone of someone who has had opinions about this for years. None of them accurate. The author of that particular one interviewed approximately 11 people, none of whom knew you. There are books about me, he said. I'm 11. There are books about you, she confirmed. The wizarding world spent 10 years without Voldemort and filled some of that time talking about the event that caused his absence. You were. She paused. Convenient subject matter. He looked at the book. He looked at the cover photo of baby himself. He looked at the subtitle. He thought about 10 years of being told he was nothing, not a person worth explaining things to, not a child worth making space for, and he thought about how simultaneously a version of him had apparently been the subject of an entire literary genre. Does it matter? Sirius asked, from his elbow. Harry considered. Not really, he said. I'm just taking inventory. Good policy. They went inside. McGonagall steered him efficiently through the first-year list and added 3 books she said weren't required but were worth having, and when Harry asked what they were she said blood magic, historical practice and modern application, foundations of charms theory, and a magical history of contract law, and he looked at her. Those aren't first-year books, he said. No, she said. He put them in the basket. Petunia, meanwhile, had found the contract law section and was standing in it with the specific focus of a woman who has decided to become competent in a subject through sheer application of will. She had 4 books already and was reading the back cover of a 5th. Sirius stood next to her and said something Harry couldn't hear, and she replied without looking up, and Sirius made a sound of genuine surprise and then something approaching respect. He'd ask about that later. They were at Ollivander's when the second Ministry Owl found them. Harry had been in the shop for 20 minutes, which Ollivander had said with gentle apology was actually quite fast given some of his more memorable cases. The wand that had chosen him, 11 inches, holly, phoenix feather, had produced a shower of red and gold sparks that made Ollivander go very quiet and very still for a moment before he said curious, very curious in a way that suggested he had thoughts he was choosing carefully. What's curious? Harry asked directly. Ollivander looked at him. He had extraordinary eyes for a very old man, pale, silvery, with the quality of someone who sees things. The phoenix who gave that feather, he said, gave only one other. Another wand. The wand that, he paused. The wand that gave you that scar. Harry held his wand. It was warm in his hand. Warmer than seemed reasonable. So my wand and Voldemort's wand have the same core. Yes. What does that mean? Ollivander looked at him with those silvery eyes. It means, he said, that you will never be able to use that wand against Voldemort's directly. The connection between them is too strong. They will react. He paused. Most people find that alarming. I find it interesting, Harry said. It means if I ever face him directly, I need a different approach. Ollivander blinked. Yes, he said. That is one interpretation. It's the only useful one, Harry said. The Ministry Owl came through the shop door at that moment with the specific officiousness of Ministry Owls, which always flew as though they were aware they represented something. It landed on the counter and looked at Harry with a bureaucratic expression and held out its leg. He took the letter. He read it standing at the counter with Ollivander watching and Sirius and McGonagall visible through the window, Petunia slightly further along the alley examining the apothecary window with the expression of someone who has committed to understanding an entire world. The letter was from the Office of Magical Contracts. It confirmed the Keystone registration. It confirmed the hearing date, 4 days, Friday morning, 10 o'clock, Wisengamot Chamber C. It confirmed that Harry Potter had full standing to address the court and that his presence was not mandatory but welcome. And at the bottom, in a handwriting that was neither official nor familiar but had the quality of someone who had written it very carefully and deliberately, was a single additional line: the court has been informed of the contract. It has also been informed of what the contract says about who you are. Come prepared to be that. A.B. He folded the letter. He put it in his pocket. Good news? Ollivander asked. Progress, Harry said. He picked up his wand case and walked to the door. They had lunch at a pub off the main alley, not the Leaky Cauldron, which was too visible, McGonagall's decision, and around a table in a back booth with plates of food between them, the shape of the next 4 days took form. McGonagall had received 3 owls during the shopping. She'd read each one with the focused expression she wore when processing information she was going to act on, and had spent the walk to the pub distilling them into a briefing. Dumbledore went to Bones this morning, she said. Directly, in person. She's told me what he said, which means she's treating me as a cooperative witness, which means she trusts my position in this. What did he say? Sirius asked. He admitted the redirections were wrong. He framed them as wartime necessity that he'd failed to undo in peacetime. He asked Bones to conduct the hearing in a way that, she paused, with the expression, didn't become a spectacle. He asked her to soften it, Sirius said flatly. He dressed it up as concern for Harry. Of course he did. Harry was eating and listening and not eating enough because he was mostly listening. What's his actual position going into the hearing? He asked. Legally. McGonagall looked at him. The mandatory nature of the hearing means he cannot avoid it. The audit's entry into the official record means the facts are not in dispute, they can be contextualized but not contradicted. The suspension of his authority as your guardian is already in effect and cannot be reversed except by the Wizengamot finding in his favor on the question of whether the redirections were legally sanctioned. She paused. They were not legally sanctioned. There is no existing law under which redirecting a personal blood contract is permissible without the subject's consent. So the facts are against him, Harry said. Yes. What is he going to do? What Albus Dumbledore does when the facts are against him, she said, with a crispness that contained about 40 years of professional experience, is appeal to something larger than facts. Legacy. Contribution. The argument that a man who has done what he has done for magical Britain should be weighed against the full scale of his works. She looked at her tea. He will be compelling. He is always compelling. And the Wizengamot is full of people who have been listening to him be compelling for a very long time. Silence around the table. Petunia spoke for the first time in a while. She had been eating and reading. She'd brought one of the books from Flourish and Blots and had it propped against the bread basket, which would have annoyed Harry on any previous day and today felt entirely right, and she set it down now with a deliberate precision. The second contract, she said. The keystone. Lily built it to be irrevocable specifically because she knew the argument that would be made. She looked at McGonagall. She didn't name Dumbledore in it by name. She didn't have to, because the audit named him. But the keystone contract structure, I read the relevant section on the way here, she gestured at her book, specifically anticipates an argument from legacy or authority. It has a clause. A legal clause that says the subject's welfare under the contract cannot be weighed against the contractor's other contributions. They're in separate categories. You cannot offset harm to the subject with benefit to third parties. McGonagall looked at her with something that moved toward surprise. Lily built in a legal argument, Harry said. She anticipated this exact defense, Petunia said. She sat down. She was 21 years old and pregnant in the middle of a war, and she wrote a clause that specifically prevented Albus Dumbledore from using his own good works to excuse the harm done to you. She looked at Harry with the expression she'd worn all day, the honest one, the one that cost her something. She knew who she was dealing with. Very quiet around the table. Sirius made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment and looked at the table, and when he looked up his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with a man who had loved a woman and watched her die and was still, 12 years later, receiving evidence of how clearly she had seen. She thought of everything, he said. She thought of everything, Harry said. He said it simply, without theater, the way you say a true thing. McGonagall gathered herself. She was, clearly, feeling things she was not going to perform at a lunch table, but she was also Minerva McGonagall and she had a hearing to prepare for. We have 4 days, she said. Harry, I want to work through the contract with you so you understand every clause before you walk into that chamber. Sirius, you need to speak to a solicitor today. Your case and Harry's are legally separate and you need independent representation. Mrs. Dursley, I'll be there, Petunia said. Yes. I was going to say that your testimony as the activating witness may be significant. I know, Petunia said. I'll be ready. The afternoon was long and full and moved at the pace of a week compressed into hours, and by the time they left Diagon Alley through the leaky cauldron and back out into Muggle London, the sun had moved west and the light had gone gold and long-shadowed, and Harry walked beside Sirius on the pavement outside the pub and they were quiet together for a moment in the way people are quiet when they've spent a day in each other's company and arrived somewhere they didn't fully expect. You all right? Sirius asked. Yeah, Harry said. He meant it. It's a lot. It is, Harry agreed. But it's a lot of the right things. He glanced at Sirius. What about you? Sirius looked at the street, the ordinary Muggle street with its ordinary evening traffic and its ordinary people who had no idea what the day had been. I've been in Azkaban for 10 years, he said. Today I went to Diagon Alley and bought ice cream. He paused, that's an extraordinary amount of progress. Harry smiled at him. You had 2 scoops. I had 3. McGonagall wasn't looking when I went back. He said it with complete lack of shame. Harry laughed. An actual laugh, unmanaged, uncalculated, the laugh of a boy who has had the longest and strangest and most significant day of his life and has found something genuinely funny at the end of it. Sirius looked at him when he laughed. He looked at him with the enormous, aching quality that had been on his face in the garden that morning, but it had changed, had moved from grief into something that could live alongside the present rather than being only about the past. She'd have been insufferably proud of you today, Sirius said. Harry looked at the street. I know, he said quietly. And the evening closed in around them, gold and warm and moving, and in 4 days there was a chamber and a court and a man who believed his good works earned him the right to make decisions for other people, and Harry Potter walked through the London evening not afraid of any of it. Chapter 5, What Dumbledore actually believed. The Wizengamot Chamber C was smaller than Chamber A, which was where the full court sat for trials of national significance, and larger than Chamber B, which was used for minor disciplinary hearings and smelled permanently of old parchment and someone's anxiety. Chamber C was where you went when the matter was serious but not theatrical, when the law required a full bench but the event itself was meant to be conducted with a minimum of spectacle. Someone had told Dumbledore it would be Chamber C. Harry had found that out from Bones 2 days ago, and he'd thought about it since, because it was the kind of detail that mattered. Chamber C was the room that said this is significant but we are being measured about it. It was a room chosen to communicate restraint. Whoever had chosen it, he suspected Bones, had made a deliberate decision about the tone they wanted, and that decision said something about how they expected the morning to go. Harry arrived 20 minutes early. He came with McGonagall, Sirius, and Petunia, and the 4 of them walked through the Ministry's atrium in the Friday morning quiet, the gold statues, the pale floor, the hum of the Floo network at the far end, and Harry moved through it with the patient observation of someone taking accurate inventory. People clocked him. Not everyone, but enough, a witch by the lifts who looked up from her folder and went still, a pair of aurors near the security desk who exchanged a glance. He let them look. He kept walking. Sirius walked at his left and slightly behind, which was a positioning choice that Harry appreciated for its subtlety, close enough to be clearly present, not close enough to suggest Harry needed managing. McGonagall was ahead of them, spine at its full formidable height, robes precisely arranged, the specific forward momentum energy of a woman who has decided the course of the day. Petunia was to his right in a dark jacket and trousers that were correct for the occasion in the way Petunia's clothes were always correct for the occasion, which was itself a kind of armor she'd worn so long it had become skill. They had spent 3 days preparing. Not in the way of people who were afraid and needed to be shored up. More in the way of people who intended to be extremely clear about what the facts were and wanted no ambiguity about it when they walked into that room. McGonagall had sat with Harry and gone through the contract clause by clause. Not because he needed tutoring, he'd read it himself, carefully, twice, but because she'd been teaching for 40 years and understood the difference between knowing something and being able to deploy it under pressure. They'd worked through every legal term, every provision, every place where the contract's language was precise in a way that mattered. At the end of the second day she had set down the parchment and said, with the particular McGonagall expression that meant something was genuinely good, "Your mother was a charms prodigy. This contract is not the work of a frightened parent. It is the work of a practitioner at the top of her field." Harry had said, "I know." He'd said it quietly, but without sadness, with something that had moved past grief into a kind of clarity about who he'd come from. Sirius had worked with his solicitor, a sharp woman named Greenwood from one of the old wizarding firms, who had spent Tuesday reviewing the Black case and emerged from the research with an expression that suggested she was genuinely angry on a professional level, which he gathered was the most useful kind of angry in a legal context. The charges against Sirius were being formally reviewed. He wasn't fully cleared yet, that required a separate proceeding, but the Wisengamot's acceptance of the blood contract's cascade review meant the original arrest was flagged as legally compromised, which meant Sirius was attending the hearing as a witness with full liberty, not as a prisoner. He wore it well. He wore borrowed dress robes that were slightly too short in the sleeve, and he stood like someone who had spent 10 years not being allowed to stand where he chose and was done with that. Petunia had spent 2 evenings reading. She had finished the contract law book from Flourish and Blots and started the blood magic history and had asked McGonagall 17 questions over the course of the preparation, each one more specific than the last, and McGonagall had answered each one fully and with increasing respect. On the third evening Petunia had said, "Lily never told me she was this good," and McGonagall had said, "She probably didn't want to seem like she was trying to impress you," and Petunia had gone quiet for a long time and then said, "She never needed to try." The lift to the courtroom levels opened with a clang. Chamber C had stone walls and fixed wooden benches arranged in a semicircle and a raised central floor where the principal stood and a bench at the front for the panel of Wisengamot members designated to the hearing. It seated perhaps 60 in the gallery. By the time Harry's group arrived, the gallery was 2/3 full and filling, which was more than Bones had anticipated, he suspected, because she was standing at the front of the room with her folder and a slight tension around the eyes that was not quite what he'd have called concern but was adjacent to it. She came to meet them at the door. "It's drawn attention," she said, keeping her voice low. "I requested that it not be publicized." "You requested it," McGonagall said. "That is not the same as controlling what people already knew. This is the most significant blood contract proceeding in 40 years and the subject is Harry Potter. Short of locking the building, Amelia." Bones exhaled through her nose. "Right. We're on schedule. The panel is assembled, 7 members, I selected them personally, none of them owed Dumbledore anything he'd want to call in today. The audit documentation is already in the record. The Keystone contract is already in the record." She looked at Harry. "You'll have time to speak after I present the formal findings." "It's not mandatory, I'll speak," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and nodded once. "The respondents' team is in the anteroom." He brought Griselda Marchbanks. "She's 90 years old," Sirius said. "She's 90 years old, she sat on the Wisengamot for 53 years, and she examined Dumbledore at his own NEWTS, which means the argument is going to be about legacy because he is literally bringing his own examiner as a character witness." Bones said it flatly. "That's actually not a bad strategy," Harry said. Everyone looked at him. "It's not a bad strategy," he said again, without apology. "He's going to stand in that room and he's going to be exactly who he is, brilliant, experienced, dedicated, and he's going to make the argument that everything he did was in service of something larger. And a lot of people in that room are going to find that argument genuinely compelling. He looked at Bones. Which means we can't argue against the man. We argue the document. Bones looked at him with the particular expression she'd worn in the kitchen at Privet Drive, the look of someone who kept being surprised in the same direction. That is exactly the approach, she said. My mother built it to be the approach, he said. She knew what would happen in a room with him. She didn't try to out-argue him. She just made the argument immovable. A bell sounded somewhere above them. The panel was taking their seats. Places, Bones said. Dumbledore entered from the side door at exactly 10 o'clock, which was itself a statement, not early, not late, precisely on time, the punctuality of a man who operated by choice and not by anxiety. He was in those same deep blue robes from Bones's description, and he walked to the respondent's position with Marchbanks at his side and his own solicitor, a thin, precise man named Croaker, one step behind. Harry was in the witnesses section with Sirius and Petunia and McGonagall. He watched Dumbledore come in. He watched the gallery's response to him, the rustling recognition, the attention that moved toward the old man like iron filings toward a magnet, and he thought about what Sirius had said in the kitchen on the first morning, accumulated trust, the kind that builds up over decades until people stop questioning the person who holds it. Dumbledore looked across the room. His gaze moved through the gallery and found Harry's, as he'd obviously known it would, because Dumbledore always knew where Harry was in any room, had been tracking him since he was a year old in the rubble of Godric's Hollow. The blue eyes looked at him, kind, intelligent, sad in the way of someone who has seen a great deal and carried it for a long time. Harry looked back. He didn't look away. He didn't arrange his expression into anything. He just met the gaze evenly and held it until Dumbledore looked to the panel, which he did after perhaps 5 seconds, and those 5 seconds said something that the whole room felt without being able to name. The presiding Wisengamot member, a heavy set which named Ogden, who had the quality of someone who had seen legal arguments of every variety and retained the ability to be surprised by very few of them, opened the proceedings with the formal summary of what was before them, a mandatory blood contract hearing, audit findings presented as prima facie evidence, the question of whether the redirections documented therein constituted a sanctioned or unsanctioned action under blood magic law. She was efficient and clear. The formality of it was like a skeleton, you needed it to hold everything else up. Bones stood and presented. She was methodical and exhaustive, and she had, clearly, spent the 3 days since Privet Drive making sure that every piece of documentation was in the right order and that each one led logically to the next, so that the overall shape of the presentation was not an argument but a demonstration. This happened. Then this happened. Then this happened. The dates were specific. The protections were named individually. The redirections were traced from Harry's contract to their destinations at Hogwarts and the order with the specificity of someone who had asked Gringotts to produce the full trail. The gallery was very quiet. She presented for 40 minutes without interruption, and at the end of it she sat down, and the record was so clean and so complete that the room held a particular kind of silence, the silence of people sitting with something that is true and cannot be made untrue. Croaker rose for the defense. He was smooth, experienced, and built his opening around exactly the argument Harry had predicted, that the context of the events was inseparable from the events themselves, that a documentation of actions without a documentation of circumstances was an incomplete picture, that the wards at Hogwarts had protected hundreds of children and the Order's network had saved dozens of lives, and these things were not irrelevant to the weighing of the Keystone contract addresses that, Harry said. The room shifted. Ogden looked at him. Croaker stopped mid-sentence. Harry was already standing. He hadn't planned to interrupt, he'd planned to wait for his formal speaking time, but the specific framing of Croaker's argument was the one that Lily had written against, and he wasn't going to let it sit in the room unchallenged while Croaker spent 10 more minutes constructing it. Mr. Potter, Ogden said. Your speaking time is, the Keystone contract has a specific clause, Harry said. He wasn't loud. He wasn't heated. He spoke with the clarity of someone who has read the document 3 times and knows exactly where everything is. Section 4, Clause 9. The subject's welfare under the terms of this contract shall not be weighed against the beneficial outcomes achieved by the contractor through actions that violated those terms. They exist in separate legal categories and shall be evaluated separately. My mother wrote that clause specifically to prevent the argument being made right now. Croker had stopped. Ogden was reading her copy of the contract. She turned to Section 4. She found Clause 9. She read it. She read it again. She looked up at Harry with the expression of someone who has just seen a legal maneuver of unusual quality. The clause is in the contract, she said. It's in the contract, Harry confirmed. He sat down. Croker looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at Harry with an expression that was not the performed warmth, that was the actual face, the one underneath, and it was complex and quiet and held, Harry thought, a genuine recognition. Croker attempted to continue. He reframed the argument, moved away from the outcome defense and toward the intent argument, which was that Dumbledore had genuinely believed the actions were in Harry's interest, that the love shield protection remained intact, that Harry had not been without protection. He had 5 of 22, Petunia said. Croker stopped again. Petunia was standing. She had her contract law book under one arm and a copy of the audit in her hand, and she looked at the panel with the expression she used on parent-teacher associations and mortgage advisors and anyone else who assumed that because she was a Muggle housewife in a sensible cardigan she did not understand what she was reading. The claim that Harry was not without protection implies the remaining protections were sufficient, she said. The audit documents that 17 of 22 were compromised. 5 remained. The love shield, which was, as the contract notes, constructed differently and immune to redirection. And 4 minor protections that are documented in the original contract as supplementary to the primary set. She looked at Croker. Supplementary means they were meant to function alongside the 17 that were taken, not in place of them. A defense that rests on the presence of 5 protections when the contract specified 22 is not a defense. It is a description of the problem. The gallery had gone to a particular kind of silence. Ogden looked at Petunia. And you are? Petunia Dursley. Née Evans. Lily Potter's sister. The activating witness for the contract and the named Muggle World signatory for the keystone. She sat down with the deliberate calm of someone who has said the precise thing she came to say. Croker looked at his notes. He looked at Dumbledore. He made a decision and sat down. Dumbledore rose. He did not wait for Croker to speak again. He rose from his chair with the ease of a man who has been in rooms like this many times and has never felt unwelcome in them, and he faced the panel and he spoke. His voice was everything they'd said it was, warm and measured and carrying the weight of something long and serious. He spoke for 6 minutes. He acknowledged the violations. He named them plainly, did not say redirections, said taking what was not mine to take. He described the immediate post-war period, the depleted defenses, the castle full of children, the specific ward failures that had driven his decisions. He did not minimize what the documents showed. He accepted the facts as they were. He spoke about Harry, about placing him with Petunia, about his reasoning, about the belief that the love shield in combination with the Muggle environment would be protection enough. I believed, he said, that I understood what Harry needed. I believed the balance I had struck was defensible. I believed it was in service of something greater, not greater than Harry, but the protection of a world that Harry would one day be central to. He paused. I was wrong. Not about the world, not about the necessity of preparation. I was wrong about my right to make those decisions alone, and I was wrong about what Harry needed, and I was wrong about the cost. He looked at Harry. I did not destroy your mother's magic, he said, directly. I borrowed it without asking, and I told myself it was for good reason, and I did not put it back. There is no version of that which is not a harm. I know that. The room was quiet. Harry stood up. Ogden said, "Mr. Potter, you may address the panel and the respondent." He walked to the central floor. He stood where the acoustics were best, which was a thing he'd noticed when he'd come in, cataloging the room. He was the smallest person on the floor by a considerable margin. He looked at Dumbledore. "I want to ask you something," he said. Dumbledore waited. "When you took the first one, the first protection, in 1982, did you know it was the identity anchor?" A pause. "Yes." "You knew what it did?" "Yes." "And you took it anyway?" I know what you needed it for." The perimeter detection ward at Hogwarts, documented in the audit. Harry kept his voice level. "I'm asking whether you understood that the identity anchor, specifically that one, was the protection that would have meant I grew up knowing what I was." He paused. "Knowing my own capability. Knowing that I had the right to understand my own nature." Dumbledore was quiet. "Because if you didn't know," Harry said, "that's one thing. Negligence. Tunnel vision. Warbrain making civilian decisions. I can follow that. It's not good enough, but I can follow the logic of it." He held the old man's gaze. "But if you knew, if you took that specific protection with full knowledge of what it did, and you took it first, before any of the others, then I need you to tell me what that decision was actually about." The chamber had the silence of 60 people not breathing. Dumbledore looked at Harry. He looked at him for a long time with those extraordinary eyes that had seen a century of magical Britain, and the something underneath his performance, the actual face, went through several things in quick succession. Then he said, "I was afraid of what you would become if no one guided you." The room moved. Not dramatically, no gasps, no theater. Just a particular shift in collective understanding, the almost physical sensation of a room full of people arriving at the same place simultaneously. "You were afraid I'd be powerful without being controllable," Harry said. "I was afraid of power without wisdom," Dumbledore said. "You come from extraordinary people. You survived something no one was supposed to survive. There is something in you, Harry, there was something in you even as an infant, that I recognized as extraordinary, an extraordinary power without guidance, so you removed my ability to understand my own power," Harry said. "To protect me from it. To ensure you developed it safely, with guidance, with your guidance." Harry said it without accusation. Just clearly. "You needed me to need you. You needed me not to know what I was so that I'd have to come to you to find out." Dumbledore was silent. "I'm not saying that's why you told yourself you were doing it," Harry said. "I believe you when you say you thought it was for the greater good. I believe you thought about the war and the children at Hogwarts and the order and all of it and decided the calculation made sense." He paused. "But my mother thought about the same war and she reached a different conclusion. She decided that the most important thing was that I knew myself. That nothing could overwrite what I was. She thought that was more important than any strategic position she could create." He let that sit for a moment. "She was right." He turned to the panel. "I'm not asking the court to destroy Albus Dumbledore," he said. "He's done things worth having done. The war happened and he was significant in ending it, and that's real. But the contract is also real, and the audit is real, and my mother built this specifically so that one thing couldn't be used to cancel out the other." He looked at Ogden. Section 4, Clause 9. Separate legal categories. I want the panel to treat them that way. He walked back to his seat. Nobody in the gallery spoke. Sirius was looking at the floor. He was doing it with enormous concentration, which Harry understood was because he wasn't going to cry in the Wizengamot and he needed somewhere to put his eyes while he got that under control. Petunia was looking at Harry. Her face was doing something that Harry had never seen it do before, something open, something that wasn't performing anything, just a woman looking at her sister's son with the full, undefended weight of 10 years of having been wrong and the specific, complicated love of someone who has decided today that honesty is the only thing left worth doing. He sat down next to her. She put her hand briefly on his arm. 1 second, maybe 2. Then she withdrew it and looked forward again. It was, Harry thought, exactly enough. The panel deliberated for 45 minutes in an anteroom while the gallery waited. Harry sat with his group and ate a sandwich Sirius produced from somewhere, he didn't ask where. Sirius had spent the morning operating with the resourcefulness of someone who'd had to be entirely self-reliant for a decade and had clearly pre-planned the lunch situation, and he looked at the ceiling of Chamber C and thought. McGonagall sat beside him and looked at the opposite wall. At one point she said, quietly and without preamble, "You're going to be extraordinary at Hogwarts." "What house?" he asked. "I have opinions," she said, with a precision that confirmed what her opinions were. He smiled. "What do you do when a sorting goes a different way than you expect?" "I trust the hat," she said. "It has been doing this for 1,000 years and I have been doing it for 40, and in my experience those are both very good reasons to trust it." Sirius looked over. "Don't ask me. I have bias." "Gryffindor?" Harry guessed. "Obviously Gryffindor. Every black ends up in Slytherin except me, and your mum was Gryffindor and James was Gryffindor and," he stopped. "And you'll go wherever you go and it'll be right." Harry thought about Draco Malfoy and Madame Malkins, the performing authority, the social calculation, the boy underneath it with the uncertain eyes. He thought about the hat being 1,000 years old and whether 1,000 years of practice at seeing people clearly meant it had opinions about identity anchors. He thought it probably did. Bones came and sat with them briefly. She looked, for the first time since Privet Drive, as though the tension around her eyes had moved towards something that might eventually be satisfaction. "The panel lead, Ogden, asked me one question before they went in," she said. "What?" Harry asked. "Whether Section 4 Clause 9 was legally binding under current blood contract statutes or whether it was an aspirational clause, the kind you write for moral force rather than legal force." She paused. "The answer is that blood contract law predates statutory law by 8 centuries. When the two conflict, blood contract law takes precedence, and a clause written in a blood contract is by definition legally binding because blood contracts are self-enforcing." She looked at Harry. "Your mother wrote law. In a letter to her sister. That will outlast this building." He thought about Lily Evans at 21, red-haired, precise, sitting somewhere in the middle of a war with a quill and 23 pages and the absolute, specific determination to make sure nothing about what she'd built could be undone by cleverness. "She knew what she was doing," he said. "She knew exactly what she was doing," Bones said. The panel returned. Ogden stood at the bench and read the findings with the same efficiency she'd opened with. The audit was accepted as legally complete and accurate. The redirections were found to be unsanctioned under blood magic law. The Clause 9 argument was accepted as legally binding. The finding on the question of sanction was unanimous. Dumbledore sat very straight through all of it with the expression of a man who has decided not to insult the process by arguing with it. The consequences were listed: suspension of his authority as magical guardian of Harry Potter, permanent, not subject to reinstatement by his own petition. A review of his Wisengamot voting rights in matters touching blood contract law, pending a secondary hearing. A mandatory contribution from the Hogwarts Ward Fund, the portion built on Lily's redirected magic, to a trust in Harry's name, the amount to be calculated by Gringotts. And a formal notation in the Ministry record. Not Azkaban. Not the full destruction of everything he'd built. Harry had meant what he said, he hadn't asked for that. What the panel had given was specific, clean, proportionate, and immovable. The kind of finding that couldn't be quietly reversed in a backroom conversation because it was in the public record and the Gringotts record simultaneously. The kind of finding Lily had built toward. Dumbledore rose when Ogden indicated he could speak. He looked at the panel. He looked at the gallery. He looked at Harry. "I will not appeal," he said. "The findings are correct." A pause. "I would like to be permitted one thing, if the panel has no objection." Ogden indicated he could continue. "I would like Harry to know something that is not in any document and will not be relevant to any proceeding." He looked at Harry directly. "I loved your parents. Not as a strategy. Not as pieces in a plan. I loved them in the specific, complicated way you love people who are extraordinary and whom you cannot protect. And I have carried the failure of that for 12 years. He paused. "I understand that is not an exoneration. I offer it only because I believe the truth should be said even when it doesn't change the outcome." Harry looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "I could tell. That's part of why it's complicated." Something moved through Dumbledore's face that might, in a different context and a different man, have been relief. He nodded once. He sat down. The hearing was closed. The gallery began to move and Sirius was on his feet and Petunia was gathering her things and McGonagall was already talking to Bones about the administrative implications of the trust fund calculation, and in the middle of all of it Harry sat in his chair for exactly 1 moment longer than everyone else. He sat, and he thought about his mother. Not with grief, exactly, because grief was something he'd been doing in one form or another for as long as he could remember, and this felt different. This felt like completion, maybe. Like the last clause of a contract finally executed. Like something that had been held open, waiting, had at last been allowed to close. She had sat down at 21 and written 22 protections and a keystone and a legal argument and a letter to her sister with specific instructions about how to be honest, and she had died before she could see any of it unfold, and it had unfolded anyway, because she had built it to unfold without her. She had trusted Petunia with the activation even though Petunia had been cold and frightened and had chosen the safe ordinary life over the extraordinary one, because Lily had understood that people are more than their worst choices and that love outlasts the choices it's made in spite of. She had been right about everything. He stood up. He picked up his jacket. He joined Sirius and Petunia and McGonagall at the door and they went out into the ministry corridor and the world that was, as of this morning, formally, legally, irrevocably different. Chapter 6, Lily's Last Charm. 3 weeks after the hearing, on a Tuesday morning in mid-August, a letter arrived at number 4, Privet Drive that was not from the ministry, not from Gringotts, not from Bones's office or McGonagall's or the solicitor handling Sirius's formal clearance. It was from Hogwarts, addressed to Harry in the same emerald green ink as the original admissions letter, but smaller, a single folded page rather than the formal packet, and it carried a different seal from the standard Hogwarts crest. Harry was in the kitchen eating breakfast when it arrived. He was eating Real breakfast, which was a development of the last 3 weeks, eggs, toast, the full thing, made by Petunia who had been cooking proper meals with the same deliberate commitment she'd brought to reading contract law books, as though competent nourishment was one of the things on her list to get right and she was getting through the list. He took the letter from the owl, fed it a piece of crust, and opened it. It was from the school librarian at Hogwarts, a woman named Madame Pants, who had written in a precise, angular hand to inform him that a restricted section of the Hogwarts library, specifically, the Blood Magic and Contractual Charms Archive, had been found, during a routine post-hearing audit of materials connected to the contract proceedings, to contain a sealed document deposited in October 1980. The seal bore the name Lily J. Potter. The document had been registered at deposit as to be opened by Harry James Potter upon commencement of his first year at Hogwarts School, or upon activation of the associated blood contract, whichever occurs first. The activation of the contract had therefore triggered its availability. Madame Pants wished to advise him that the document would be held for him at the library desk and could be collected at any time after September the 1st. Harry read the letter. Then he read it again. "What is it?" Petunia asked, from the other side of the kitchen. He handed it to her without saying anything. She read it. Her hands were very still on the page. "She hid something at Hogwarts," Petunia said. "She hid something at Hogwarts," Harry confirmed. They looked at each other. Sealed with her name, Petunia said. In the blood magic archive. She turned the letter over, as though there might be more on the back. There wasn't. She put it there in October 1980. You were born in July. She was 3 months out from having me, Harry said. And already at Hogwarts depositing documents in the restricted archive. He picked up his fork, thought about it, set it down again. She really did think of everything. Petunia set the letter on the table between them. She looked at it with the expression she wore now when something about Lily hit her unexpectedly, not the old closed-off expression, not grief performing itself, but something more direct. Something that looked at the pain instead of around it. I want to know what it says, she said. You'll have to wait until September the 1st, Harry said. She gave him a look. I'm aware of that, Harry. I'm just saying. He picked his fork back up. I've been waiting 11 years. 3 more weeks is fine. She made a sound that was not quite agreement and returned to the washing up, and Harry ate his eggs and looked at the letter on the table and thought about his mother at 21, already building the architecture of something she wasn't sure she'd survive, already placing pieces on a board he wouldn't be able to see for 11 years. He thought about the vault at Gringotts, the contract pages, the keystone, and now this, one more piece, the last one, sealed in a library and waiting. The thought that rose in him wasn't grief. It was a kind of awe, not the soft, passive kind, but something active, like standing at the base of something enormous and built and understanding the scale of the engineering that went into it. She had known she might not live. She had built accordingly. She had made sure that even her absence had structure, had intention, this was the word that kept arriving, direction. Her death had a direction to it. It pointed somewhere. And every morning of the last 3 weeks, Harry had woken up and felt the 22 protections sitting cleanly in his magical core like a set of rooms that had always been there and were finally, properly furnished, and he understood that his mother's death had been pointing here, to this morning, to eggs and real toast and Petunia doing the washing up and Sirius's letter from last Friday on the counter saying clearance came through, fully formal, Pettigrew located in Devonshire of all places. Bones sends her regards and also says she's considering filing additional charges, so it's been a productive week. It had been a productive 3 weeks. Harry had found that the word productive suited the period better than any of the more dramatic alternatives. Things had happened, important things, real things, and they had happened in a steady sequence rather than all at once, and he'd moved through them with the attention they required and come out the other side still himself, which the identity anchor would have said was the point. He finished his breakfast. He washed his own plate. He went upstairs to read. The morning Sirius arrived for the last time before September was a Saturday in late August, one of those late summer days where the light has a different quality from July, less brilliant, more deliberate, the kind of light that knows it's running out of time. He came by the front door now, not the back garden. He knocked, and Petunia opened it, and he came in and went to the kitchen and made his own tea, which was a development that had happened somewhere in the middle of August when Petunia had said, entirely without performance, "You know where the kettle is," and Sirius had understood this for the significant statement it was. The house had changed. Not dramatically, it was still the same house, same furniture, same sparrows on the garden wall, but the quality of it had changed the way a room changes when you open a window. Vernon was, by that point, spending most of his time at work or at his golf club, which Harry suspected was a form of strategic retreat he had no particular objection to. Dudley was at a summer camp for the second 2 weeks of August that Petunia had arranged with the calm efficiency of someone managing logistics, and the house without Dudley in it had a spaciousness that was partly literal and partly atmospheric. Harry was in the living room when Sirius came through, sitting cross-legged on the sofa with one of the books from Diagon Alley, the Blood Magic History, open in his lap and his wand on the cushion beside him. He'd been practicing. Not anything he'd read in a textbook, because he didn't have first-year textbooks yet, but things Sirius had shown him in the back garden over the last 2 weeks, basic wand work, the physical grammar of it, the way intention and motion and the particular quality of your attention combined into something that either worked or didn't. He had a good handle on the either-or of it. When it worked cleanly, with no fuss, in a way that Sirius had stopped commenting on after the third day because commenting on it seemed to make it self-conscious. "Ready for Thursday?" Sirius asked, dropping into the armchair. "Yeah," Harry said. Sirius studied him. "You're not nervous?" "I'm interested," Harry said. "That's different. For most people going to Hogwarts for the first time they're the same thing." "Are they?" Harry considered. "I think nervous is interest without confidence. I'm interested but I'm also," he paused, "I don't know. Everything I was going to be afraid of I've already done. The Ministry. Gringotts. Meeting McGonagall for the first time. I've done all of those things in the last 3 weeks and they were fine." "The sorting," Sirius offered. "The sorting is one conversation with a hat." Sirius looked at him for a moment. "It is genuinely bizarre watching you not be afraid of things," he said. "In the best possible way. James was never afraid of anything either, but he performed it differently. He made a show of the not being afraid, like it was something to broadcast. He gestured. "Don't," Harry said. "Don't," Sirius confirmed. Harry looked at his book. "I keep thinking about the thing at Hogwarts," he said. "The document. What it might be. She hid something at Hogwarts in 1980 and didn't tell me about it," Sirius said, "which means she was being very deliberate about who knew. She told me about the contract because she needed me to know in case something happened before she could activate it herself. Whatever's in the library, she didn't need anyone to know about until you could get to it yourself." "Which means it's not logistical," Harry said. "It's not more legal protection. She'd already done all the legal work. This is something else. What does the blood magic history say about supplementary deposits?" Sirius asked, nodding at the book. Harry had been reading for that exact reason. He'd found the relevant section 2 days ago. Blood magic practitioners sometimes deposited what they called anchor objects, not contractual, not legally binding, but tied to the practitioner's magical signature. They were used as, the book calls them, intentional residue. The idea that when you've put enough of your magic into a project, you can deposit something of yourself alongside it that the magic can draw on after you're gone. To extend the intent of the work. He paused. The analogy in the book is a gardener leaving notes in the soil. The contract is the plant. The anchor object is the notes. It doesn't grow the plant but it informs what grows. Very quiet in the living room. "She left you something of herself," Sirius said. "That's what I think," Harry said. Sirius was looking at the far wall with the particular expression he wore when he was thinking about Lily, that enormous, aching thing, smaller now than it had been on the first morning, reshaped by the weeks into something that could sit alongside the present rather than overwhelming it. "She was very thorough," he said, quietly. "She was," Harry said. "I've been thinking about what that cost her." He closed the book. "Not the magic. The thinking. Spending the last year of her life building all of this, the contract, the keystone, whatever's in the library, doing all of that while also having a baby and fighting a war and trying to have something like a normal life." He looked at his hands. "She was doing all of it at once. And she kept it from James so he wouldn't worry, and she kept most of it from you so you wouldn't try to help, and she did it in secret, and she was 21 years old." Sirius said nothing for a long moment. "She was remarkable," he said finally. "I know that's insufficient." "It's true, though," Harry said. "That's enough." Petunia found Harry in the garden that afternoon. He was sitting on the back step in the late August sun with his wand turning slowly in his fingers, not practicing, just thinking with his hands, which was something she'd noticed he did when he was working through something. He looked up when she came out and moved over automatically to make room, which he'd started doing without being asked around the second week. She sat beside him. She had a cup of tea. She looked at the garden. It was a good garden, she'd always kept it properly. Roses along the fence, the lawn edged clean, the beds weeded. She'd spent a lot of years in this garden being very deliberate and very contained and looking at perfectly maintained flower beds as evidence that things were in order. It looked different now. Or she looked at it differently, which amounted to the same thing. "I want to tell you something before you go on Thursday," she said. Harry waited. "I've been thinking about what I could have done differently," she said. "I've made rather a project of it, actually. Catalogue the specific choices and what drove them." She paused. "I thought I was afraid of magic. I told myself I was afraid of it, what it did to Lily, how it took her away from the family, from me, and then how it got her killed, and how it left you on my doorstep, and I wanted none of it in my house because it took things." She looked at the roses. "But I've been honest about it, and what I actually was is, not afraid of magic. Afraid of what loving Lily meant. What it always cost me and what I never got back, and how the easiest way to stop paying that cost was to decide the thing that took her was monstrous and I had nothing to do with it." Harry was listening. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the garden too, which made it easier, she thought. Looking at the same thing rather than at each other. "She wrote that letter to me," Petunia said. "Not to a solicitor. Not to Dumbledore. To me. She put my name on it and she put it under your bed and she expected me to find it and read it and do something with it. Even after everything." She paused. "Even knowing that I'd been cold and I'd been resentful and I'd kept you in a cupboard." She stopped. "She knew you'd get here eventually," Harry said. "She had a great deal more faith in me than the evidence supported." "Maybe," Harry said. "Or maybe she just knew you better than you knew yourself." Petunia considered this. "That was a very Lily thing for me to have just done," she said, "and a very Lily thing for you to have just said. I'm not sure what to do with that." Harry glanced at her sideways. "You could start by not calling me the boy." She looked at him. "When you think about me," he said. It wasn't accusatory. Just observational. "You use the boy. I've heard you say it. I've heard you think it, you have a face for it. It means something that keeps me at a distance. I thought maybe that was worth naming before September." She held his gaze. Felt, again, the quality of it, that directness that was so like Lily and so entirely his own, the refusal to pretend that the thing in the room wasn't in the room. "Harry," she said, deliberately. He looked at her with those eyes. "From now on," she said. "Harry." He nodded. He looked at the garden. "Then, I know it wasn't nothing. These 3 weeks. I know it wasn't, I know it cost you something. It's the least, I'm not saying it's enough," he said. "I'm saying it wasn't nothing. Those are different things and both of them are true." She thought about Clause 9 of the Keystone Contract. Separate legal categories. Both true simultaneously. She thought about Lily at 7 in their mother's garden catching falling leaves. "Yes," she said. "Both of them are true." They sat in the late August sun and drank their tea and the garden was quiet around them and it was, she thought, the most honest thing she'd ever done, not the testimony at the hearing, not the countersigning at Gringotts, but this. Sitting in the sun with her sister's son and calling the things in front of her by their right names. September the 1st. King's Cross was King's Cross, crowded and echoey and smelling of diesel and takeaway coffee, the huge ceiling vaulting overhead and the announcements coming from every direction in the overlapping way of large stations that have accepted the impossibility of clarity. Petunia had driven. Sirius had been in the back seat with the trunk and a large cage containing an owl Harry had bought at Elop's 3 weeks ago, a snowy white owl, female, that he'd named Hedwig, who regarded the back of Sirius's head with calm avian composure. The platform 9 3/4 entrance was, Harry thought, a better piece of magic than it had any right to be, the idea that the barrier between worlds was a wall you walked through confidently, with your trolley, and the confidence was the mechanism. It suited him. He ran at it with exactly enough speed, and the world went from King's Cross to a steam-filled platform thick with people and noise and the smell of smoke and magic, and the Hogwarts Express sat beside the platform in full scarlet solidity like something from a very specific and particular dream. McGonagall was there. She was directing first years with the practiced authority of someone who had done this 38 times and found the chaos no less chaotic for the repetition. She saw Harry immediately, he suspected she saw everyone immediately, it was a professional condition, and made her way over with the directness of a woman who does not alter course. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Professor," he said. She looked at Sirius. Sirius looked at her. Something passed between them in the way that things passed between people who had known each other for decades and had been on the wrong side of something together and were still working out what they were on the right side of. "Don't cause problems," she said. "I never cause problems," he said, with complete false sincerity. "In 30 years you have never once," she stopped. "Sirius." "Minerva." "I'm glad you're here," she said, very quietly, in her own voice. He looked at her. "Me too," he said. She touched his arm once, briefly, and moved back to her first years. Harry looked at the train. He looked at the platform full of families and owls and familiar faces he didn't know yet and the vast, specific aliveness of a world that had been waiting for him. Petunia was standing slightly back from the platform's main crowd, near the barrier, not comfortable exactly but not performing discomfort either, just present, in the way she'd been learning to be present these last weeks. She had her bag and her sensible jacket and the expression of a woman standing at the edge of something she doesn't fully belong to and choosing to be there anyway. Harry went to her. "I'll write," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." He looked at her. "You could write back," he said. "Hedwig can find you." "I know how to write a letter," she said, with the dry precision that he'd found, over the summer, was her version of warmth. "Okay," he said. She looked at him and he looked at her and the moment had a fullness to it that neither of them tried to reduce by filling it with more words. Then she said, she would be, and stopped, and started again. "She is proud of you. Whatever she built, whatever she put in that library, whatever the rest of it is, all of it is just her saying what she would have said out loud if she'd been here." She looked at him steadily. "She is proud of you." Harry held that for a moment. "I know," he said. He hugged her. He just did it, not tentatively, not asking permission, just stepped forward and put his arms around her in the way you hug someone when you mean it, and she stiffened slightly for exactly 1 second and then her arms came around him, and she held on with the specific, fierce quality of someone who has spent a long time not holding on to things and has decided to be done with that. She let him go. She stepped back. She was very composed. "Go on," she said. "You'll miss the train." He went. The library at Hogwarts was magnificent. Harry had seen it briefly during the brief orientation McGonagall had arranged in the week before term began, a sweep through the main sections, the layout, the general rules from Madame Pants, who delivered them with the expression of someone who has been defending books from students for decades and regards the relationship as ongoing warfare. He had noted the restricted section at the back, separated by a rope and a set of enchantments, and he had noted the door to one side of it that was smaller than the others and had a different kind of seal. He had been waiting since September the 1st and it was now September the 3rd, 2 days of lessons, of getting the shape of the castle, of figuring out which staircases moved and where the Charms classroom was and what the Hufflepuff common room smelled like, which he knew because Neville Longbottom had described it with the particular enthusiasm of someone who is very pleased with their house and wants everyone to know. And now it was Wednesday afternoon, his first free period, and he was in the library. Madame Pants produced the sealed document from behind the desk with the expression of someone handing over something that had been in her professional custody for 11 years and had occasionally given her what she could only describe as feelings, which was not something she was accustomed to from library materials. It was a cylinder. Not a scroll, a proper sealed cylinder of what felt like very old wood under his fingers, with a stopper at one end sealed in wax the color of old blood and carved with a symbol he recognized from the contract, Lily's blood magic seal, the interlocking pattern she'd used as a signature throughout the document. "Do you need a private space?" Madame Pants asked, with the careful neutrality of a librarian who has inferred a great deal. "Yes," Harry said. "Please." She brought him to the small room beside the restricted section, a reading room, low-ceilinged, with a single window that looked out onto the courtyard. She left him there and closed the door. He sat at the table and looked at the cylinder. He thought about his mother putting this here. Standing in this library, he looked at the window, at the courtyard beyond it, standing somewhere in this building 11 years ago, pregnant, deliberate, placing this where it would wait. What had she been thinking when she did it? Had she known already that the war was almost over and that it wasn't going to end well? Had she already accepted that she was going to die? He thought about the identity anchor and the knowledge protections and the keystone contract and all the legal architecture, and he thought about how much of it was about protection, keeping him safe, keeping him legal, keeping the structures around him sound, and he thought about what a person who had done all of that might put in a library for the one moment that wasn't about protection. He broke the seal. The cylinder opened cleanly. He tilted it and a scroll slid into his hand, and when he unrolled it he found not 23 pages but 3, and the handwriting was the same as everything else, Lily's, but different in quality from the contract letters, from the precise contractual language, from even the personal sections of the main document. This was the handwriting she'd used when she was writing quickly, when she was writing without editing, the way Petunia had described her writing in the first letter Lily had ever sent home from Hogwarts, fast and a bit sideways and completely full of what she was actually thinking. He read. "Harry. If you're reading this then everything worked. The contract activated, the audit ran, Toonie opened the letter, I knew she would, she just needed time, she always needs time to be brave, which is a different kind of bravery than anyone gives her credit for, and you found your way here. And you're at Hogwarts, which means you're 11, which means I've been gone for 10 years. I've been trying to write this part for 3 months and I keep failing because I don't know how to write a letter to someone I haven't met yet who is also the most important person in my life. So I'm going to stop trying to do it well and just do it. You come from love. Not a beautiful abstract kind, a specific, embarrassing, sometimes stupid kind. Your father once turned himself into a stag accidentally because he was showing off for me and I laughed at him for 20 minutes and he was so completely unoffended. He loved me showing off for him. He loved that I laughed. He was the most genuinely comfortable person in themselves I ever met, and it didn't come from never being afraid. It came from not being ashamed of being afraid. That's yours too, Harry. You come from that. I need to tell you about the last charm. Everything else I built was about protection. The love shield, the identity anchor, the knowledge protections, the legal architecture, all of it, it was about making sure nobody could take things from you and making sure the record was accurate and making sure you had what was yours. All of that is important and I don't regret a day of it. But there is one thing I made that isn't in any contract. It's not in any legal record. It doesn't have a name in the books because I think I'm the first person to try to make it and I'm honestly not certain it worked, which is why I didn't document it anywhere, because if I documented it and it didn't work that would be a particularly sad outcome. What I tried to do was leave something of myself in you. Not a protection. Not a charm that does anything. Just a resonance. The magical equivalent of a fingerprint. My specific signature, the one that runs through everything I built, also running through you. So that when you use your magic, not all the time, just occasionally, in the moments when you're most completely yourself, you might feel something that's also me. I don't know if it works. I've never heard of anyone successfully doing it. The theory is sound, the practice is original, and the testing methodology is inherently impossible because I can't be here to evaluate the results. But I tried. And what I want you to know, whether it worked or not, is why I tried. I tried because I wanted one thing that wasn't about keeping you safe or keeping the record straight or making sure the world treated you correctly. I wanted something that was just about being your mother. About being in the room with you even when I can't be in the room. You are going to do extraordinary things. Not because of Voldemort, not because of prophecies, not because of what anyone needs you to be. Because you are your father's stubbornness and my precision and something else entirely that is entirely yours, and extraordinary things happen in the vicinity of people like that. I love you. I love you in the specific embarrassing stupid way. I love you so much that I spent the last year of my life building legal documents in my spare time so that nobody could take things from you after I was gone. I love you so much that I hid something in a library and trusted a stern librarian I've never met to keep it for 11 years. I love you so much that I wrote a letter to my cold and frightened sister and trusted her to be brave enough to read it. She wasn't she? She was. Go be extraordinary. Not for anyone else. For the reason your father turned himself into a stag in the middle of the corridor, because it delighted you, because you wanted to see, because some things are worth doing just for the way they feel when they're happening. I'll be in the magic, Harry. I built enough of it into enough things. You'll feel me. All my love, Mum. He sat with it for a long time. The reading room was very quiet and the afternoon light through the small window had gone golden and long, the specific light of early September when summer is leaving and the year is turning, and Harry sat with 3 pages of his mother's handwriting in his hands and let himself feel the full, clean weight of it. He wasn't crying, exactly. There was something happening in his chest that was large and warm and had no clean category, not grief anymore, not its own thing, something that contained both and was also something else. Something that felt like being known. Like being seen clearly by someone who is not in the room. He picked up his wand. He didn't think about it. He just picked it up the way he'd picked it up every time over the summer, the warm familiar weight of it, 11 inches of holly and phoenix feather and a magical core that was his down to the bone. He held it loosely, not pointing at anything. Just holding it in the quiet room. And there was a warmth. Not the warmth of the 22 protections, not the ambient glow he'd noticed the morning of his birthday, something different, something underneath all of that, something that had been there so long and so quietly that he'd taken it as simply the texture of himself. He sat with it, and he thought, oh. Not that's new. Not what is that. Just, oh. The sound of something recognized. Something that had been there his whole life, patient and warm and woven through his magic at the most fundamental level, something that every suppressed protection and redirected charm had failed to reach because it wasn't in any of those categories, wasn't a protection at all, was simply presence. The specific presence of someone who loved you so absolutely that they'd found a way to put it somewhere no one could take it. He thought, I think it worked, Mum. He didn't say it out loud. He thought it, clearly and directly, with the particular quality of attention he'd found over the summer, the real focus, not the managed surface focus, but the deep kind, the kind that was entirely his own. The warmth in the wand pulsed once, gently. Like a heartbeat. Like a response. He wrote to Petunia that evening, from the Gryffindor common room with Hedwig on the chair beside him, while the fire crackled and Neville sat across from him doing herbology notes with the focused contentment of someone doing exactly the thing they were made for. Ron Weasley was somewhere near the window attempting chess against himself, which was not going well, and the common room was warm and loud and alive in the specific way of places that have contained a great deal of living for a very long time. Dear Aunt Petunia, I found what she left in the library. I can't explain all of it yet, some of it needs more thinking. Some of it I want to say in person. But I want you to know that she wrote about you. Right at the end. She said, she wasn't she? She was. She meant it. She knew you would be. Hogwarts it's a lot. I'll tell you everything. The moving staircases are exactly as irritating as they sound and the ceiling in the Great Hall shows the actual weather outside which today was overcast but has cleared up now. The Sorting Hat argued with me for 30 seconds, which I thought was interesting, and we reached an agreement that I think worked out for both of us. I haven't been afraid of anything. Sirius says that's a genetic condition and I should tell people it's a choice so they're less alarmed. I think it probably is a choice, actually, or it's become one. I'll keep working on the distinction. I feel her in the magic. I don't know if that makes sense. I think it might only make sense to you. Right back. Harry. He folded the letter. He tied it to Hedwig's leg. She ruffled her feathers at him with the expression of a bird who has decided that her person is quite something and she's going to take that assignment seriously. Go find her, he said. You know where she is. Hedwig flew. 3 weeks after that, a letter arrived at number 4, Privet Drive. Petunia was alone in the house, Vernon was at work, Dudley was at school, the house was quiet in the way it used to be quiet, which was a hollow kind of quiet, and then in the way it had been quiet since July, which was different. Less hollow. More like space that was being held for something. The owl came to the kitchen window and she let it in and took the letter and fed it biscuit without thinking about it, which was itself a change, and she sat down at the kitchen table in the autumn morning light and opened it. She read it. She read the part about the library. She read the end. She wasn't she? She was. She sat with it for a long time. The kitchen was ordinary around her, clean and correct and full of the specific quiet of a life she had made very deliberately over a long time. It had been a good life, some of it. It had been a life that protected itself very effectively from a lot of things, including the thing it most needed, which was the knowledge that love did not require you to be deserving of it before it arrived. She thought about a girl in a back garden in Cokeworth, catching leaves. She thought about a letter hidden under a cot for 10 years, waiting. She thought about when you're ready to be honest. She got up. She found paper, proper writing paper, the nice kind she kept in the second drawer. She found a pen. She sat down. She wrote back.